Okay, I think we're live. Good morning, everyone. It is Saturday, July 29th, 2023, with another edition of the Saturday Free School for Philosophy and Black Liberation. As usual, just in different rooms or little squares. I'm here with my fellow colleagues of the Saturday Free School. Today, we're going to discuss what is being termed a summer of strikes. And then after we have a discussion of the summer of strikes and what is being said about it, but what it really shows or doesn't show, we'll also have a discussion of the film Oppenheimer, which was recently released. And then after that, we will then discuss two reviews. One is a review by Archishman Raji, a member of the Saturday Free School, on Martin Wolf's recent book. And then the second review is by Michelle Liu on the recent Broadway showing of Lorraine Hansberry's last play, A Sign in Sidney Brewster's Window. So it's a packed free school, and I'm really looking forward to it. But unless you have something you want to say before we do doc, we can start with the summer of strikes. Okay, well, today we first wanted to talk about what is being termed a summer of strikes. And especially because the mainstream media is making a big deal of it and there's a lot of conversation around it. I think it's something like, I saw an article saying that it's an estimated 650,000 workers across different unions and industries possibly could go on strike this summer. And I think that number is reduced because, as some people know, the Teamsters recently agreed to a tentative agreement with UPS, which I think would take away 350,000 workers from going on strike. But just to say that this so-called summer of strikes covers like some of what's being included in the summer of strikes are unions like Teamsters, who recently, like I said, settled a tentative agreement with UPS. That TA will have to be ratified by their, I think, around 330 to 350,000 members over the next 3 weeks. Other unions include the UAW, the United Auto Workers, are in contract negotiations with what's considered the big three of the auto industry, which is Ford, GM, and I actually forget the third one. Ford, GM, and
Chrysler.
And then there's a bunch of other unions in smaller industries that are also considering going on strike. Some of them include the American Airlines, like Los Angeles hotel workers, of course, the Screen Actors Guild and Writers Guild of America. And then others are also trying to kind of attach themselves to the summer of strikes, Starbucks workers, et cetera, et cetera. But what we wanted to talk about this morning was the summer of strikes, what's being termed the summer of strikes. It's supposed to, most people, the news, when they're talking about the summer of strikes, they're trying to make it seem like this is a big uprising of workers in a moment when workers really need their wages up, making it seem like workers are going to make serious gains through strikes. This is a new moment of labor activity and labor militancy. But actually what's not being talked about is the fact that just having a strike, we're in a moment in US history where just terming something a strike or even having a strike is not the complete picture and doesn't necessarily translate in of itself to labor militancy. But actually the real question when talking about strikes in this moment is whether you have the union leadership, organized labor leadership, to do a strike the way it has to be done in this current crisis, but also this current economy for it to actually be successful for the membership and the workers. And so there's two things with it. Is the most important thing is not just the strike in of itself, but what kind of strike. For example, currently organized labor, I looked up the stats, like something that has to be talked about is the fact that organized labor is only like 10%. Well, in the private sector, it's 6%. Private sector, it's 6% is unionized. And, oh shoot, where's my other notes? So overall across the American workforce, 10% is unionized, and actually only 6% of the private sector in particular is unionized. It's a little different with the public sector, which is 33% of the public sector, but the overall 10% of the American workforce that is currently unionized is far different than the last time the Bureau of Labor Statistics did a count of union density, which is back in 1983. For comparison, over 20% of the American workforce is unionized. So that's like one half of union density of 1983, which just shows you how little of the American workforce, which is like wage and salaried workers, is actually organized labor. So the majority of American workers are unorganized. And so it brings up the question, if we're going to talk about a summer of strikes, not just what kind of strike is needed, which is a prolonged, very militant strike that requires strong leadership that will not only lead the workers, but won't simply give in or bend strategically. But it's also a question of, can you have a militant strike of organized labor without also making inroads to unorganized labor? Because the fact is most of the workforce is unorganized, and there's such low density. And actually, when I was looking into like what sections of the economy are actually unionized, the top organized sections of the workforce are mainly in protective services, so security officers, like jobs like that, or the second would be education, training, and libraries. So that's really different from when membership was really high in industries such as like the UAW, which would be like auto workers, or other industries like steel, railroads. So it's also showing a difference in, it also shows that the reason for such low union density is also has the fact that of deindustrialization has also had an impact on union density. But the other thing, so going back to this whole marketing of a summer of strikes, this is a great moment for organized labor or for workers to end up with something victorious. The thing is a good example of that there isn't the type of union leadership ready in this kind of moment with such low union density, and also in what is a domestic crisis of war, is the example of the Teamsters, which is they settled this quote unquote great contract where they did make some gains, but there are even a lot of parts of the membership who are not completely happy with the TA. And I don't know the total inside scoop of the tentative agreement and the internal politics of the union, but it does show that there was a threat of a strike, and there was all this marketing over we're ready to strike, we're ready to have a militant strike to get what we want. But what ended up happening was the tentative agreement, especially in terms of part-time workers, who are the people who put packages on the trucks, take them off, who sort the packages. Those are the part-time workers. They were demanding at least $25 per hour minimums. And a huge part of the membership, it's over 50% of the membership of UPS workers are actually part-time. They ended up with $21 an hour, which is far better than the past minimum wage for part-time. But it shows something that the membership is also not completely happy, that the leadership had to, at the end, the leadership of the Teamsters at the end had to, they would prefer not to take their workers on strike, possibly because their workers maybe weren't even ready, or they weren't ready to take leadership of that, and instead were ready to agree to a TA that didn't completely meet their goals, but they felt were sufficient enough for this current moment. So that just kind of shows an example of the moment we're in with labor, organized labor. But going back to this thing of, if there's going to be a summer of real strikes where the rank and file workers will actually be able to make serious gains in the way they need to, is the fact that the only successful new organizing drive that has happened in the past years has been the Amazon Labor Union, led by Chris Smalls. which is one facility on Staten Island. It's a facility called JFK 8. And that was one of the only examples of a really important, successful organizing drive of unorganized workers in what is a very important industry in the US. But the thing is, and even Chris Smalls himself, in responding to the Teamsters tentative agreement, he said that it's not enough to just try to take your workers on strike, which is not even guaranteed to be successful if your members are not ready to strike and you yourself as the leadership are not ready to lead your workers on strike. But it's also a problem that most of the workforce in America is unorganized. And so if you're going to think about the future of organized labor or even the future of the working class, you can't simply lead workers on strike without a wave of organizing workers in unorganized sections of industry. But the interesting thing is Chris Smalls, who is noting that, he is now under attack. And he's under attack by a reform caucus that is full of a lot of leftists who are interested in attaching themselves to this, this growing movement of labor organizing that's being termed the summer of strikes, a new labor movement, something that can push forward, their argument can push forward, push forward progress and for what everyone knows is not actually, which is a working class and poor that are not becoming less poor, but are staying poor or becoming poorer. The third thing I wanted to talk about is also that the summer of strikes, the way it's being marketed, I think cannot be detached from Biden in the 2024 election. Because already, I was looking into it, already the White House and Biden himself is trying to position himself as part of this summer of strikes, him as a heavily pro-labor president. And this is after last year when Biden, using an almost 100-year-old Railway Labor Act, used that to help crush the railroad workers' strike and prevent the railroad workers from striking after they rejected the tentative agreement. And so Biden is now attaching himself to the summer of strike, saying that actually what is empowering workers to even feel like they can go on strike is the fact that our economy is so good, that we have the lowest unemployment in decades, that there are so many job openings, that workers have the advantage nowadays to be able to go on strike. And so the White House is saying currently that actually the fact that Bidenomics is working, that our economy is in such a good place, has allowed workers like the UPS workers to be in an advantageous position to even go on strike, fight for higher pay, fight for higher benefits. And so it's being marketed as a way to say that actually the summer of strike shows how pro-labor this administration is. And so that's kind of the spin that's happening. And the reason why someone like Chris Smalls becomes so important is because even the Teamsters leadership, union leadership currently, who are not confident in themselves, seemingly not willing to even lead their own workers, their own rank and file, into a very militant, prolonged strike, which is the only strike that would be able to win everything that they would want to win. It's that kind of leadership that is also allowing Biden to attach himself to organized labor, and organized labor leadership themselves are attaching themselves to Biden. And so the kind of narrative that is now coming up with this summer of strikes is this narrative that the real sides are Biden and organized labor against Wall Street and greedy CEOs, when actually, which is a distraction from the real paradigm, which is Biden and the ruling elites. Like we talked in Free School last week, it's not enough to just say ruling class. It's more about a ruling elite and their war agenda. So Biden, the ruling elite, a war agenda and a war economy that allowed for so many jobs in the auto industry, in the steel industry, coal industry to decline. And which is also why you do have workers who want to strike. You have workers who want to be militant because they know that they have gotten the short end of the stick for too long, which is also why you have membership that says $21 is more than $17 an hour, but I still want $25 an hour. Like, why can't I have more? Why can't I fight for more? Why don't you want to take us out on strike? Like, why can't we do more, fight more? And so actually the real paradigm would be Biden and the ruling elite, a war agenda, a war economy versus the American people and the rank and file. And the real question is for union leadership is, are you going to continuously allow yourself to be attached to what is a ruling elite war agenda in Biden? Or are you going to follow, or are you going to listen to your own rank and file and detach yourself from that? Mm-hmm. Because already there is this coalescing of Biden and union leadership to help Biden. You know, it's a big part of Biden's 2024 election campaign is both Bidenomics, but also how organized labor is backing Biden, that they themselves are happy with the economy, when actually that's not true. The fact is that, like I said, like the amount of jobs, the amount of union workers unionizing is not the amount of non-union workers unionizing is the pace of them. Okay, I'm sorry. The pace of non-union workers organizing is far lower than the number of jobs being added, which means that even if more jobs are, I don't know what jobs these are, but even if there are jobs being created, the number of those jobs being union or unions being able to organize them is far lower, which is why you have like a 10% union density, which is lower than even last year. And so what you're seeing is a steady decline of union membership. And that's not just because of organizing, but that's also because of the possibility of union workers decertifying their unions because they've had enough. They feel like, what was the point all these years of having a union that stabbed us in the back, that didn't help us protect our jobs, that didn't stand with us against a war agenda proposed and supported by politicians who you're encouraging us to elect. And the last thing I wanted to say was just that the reason why someone like Chris Smalls of the Amazon labor union becomes so interesting is that, first of all, I don't know if you guys remember, but last year when Amazon labor union was successfully was able to organize just one facility, but this was something that no other established union could do. But Chris Smalls, Amazon worker who was fired, he plus some other of his friends in the facility were able to successfully organize their union, and they're in the middle of a contract. They're in the middle of bargaining a contract. He refused to allow Amazon labor union to join an established union, and instead said, we want an independent union. So that was the first important thing. And then the second important thing is that now Chris Smalls is coming out in response to the Teamsters agreement saying it's not enough to just like threaten to take your workers on strike. You have to be able to actually lead that strike effectively and militantly, and your members have to be prepared to strike, which is oftentimes currently is not necessarily even true, that most workers may not be ready to afford to strike, may not be ready to strike. The leadership may not be ready to lead their workers to strike. And they may strike and not even get the tentative agreement that reaches everything that they said that they were demanding, like $25 an hour, not $21 an hour. The other thing that Chris Smalls called out was saying that actually not only is it the union leadership, but also politicians who have stabbed the workers in the back. And so and he called for a third party. He said, that's why we need a labor party. That becomes important because Chris Smalls himself is showing that there is an allegiance or an alliance between existing union leadership and the Democratic Party in particular, that will not necessarily put the workers' demands at the top, but will try to compromise or work together to sufficiently do enough to assuage workers who may join into an emerging political rebellion, but not completely go all the way to take the workers to where they need to be and be as militant as they have to be. And so it's interesting that Chris Smalls is calling for a labor party, which honestly, I read it as he's keeping himself and his union independent, and it creates an opening for Chris Smalls and other people like him, his workers, to join what we have termed at the Free School a triad of opposition, which is not going to go along with the Democratic Party, not going to go along with the status quo. And what's also becoming interesting is Chris Smalls is now being attacked. by, the progressives and even the Communist Party USA. The Communist Party USA, who was part of the Reform Caucus, organizing against Chris Smalls and calling for elections to oust him. So just wanted to talk about this quote unquote summer of strikes, because it seems to be the big quote movement that not only the mainstream media is making a big deal of, but also the left itself is trying to include themselves into. Like groups like the Communist Party USA, other leftist groups are concentrating a lot on this idea of the vanguard of progress. The vanguard of progress in this country will be organized labor, without understanding where the rank and file are actually at and who actually has the rank and file's interests at heart. And it's not necessarily the leadership of these big unions who are showing that they may not be the most prepared to take their workers on strike, which is what they would have to do in a militant and prolonged way. Actually, this is my one last note, is the last union the remaining big union to watch out for, actually, besides SAG and WGA, the Screen Actors Guild and Writers Guild, is the UAW, which is the United Auto Workers. The reason why they're interesting is because they have a new president who is considered very left-leaning. What's interesting about the UAW is the leadership of the UAW has refused to endorse Biden. And they are also in the middle of threatening a strike. The reason why they have withheld their endorsement of Biden is because they said they're unhappy with Biden's stance on promoting electric vehicle development without considering the future of auto workers. The reason why that is interesting is not that dissimilar from the Teamsters or other similar industries that were much stronger back in the 70s or 80s, is that I feel like what we're seeing is that unions like the UAW, auto workers, they are at a point where the economy is so not working for their membership that it causes the possibility of them becoming politically independent and breaking away from the Democratic Party. Because the auto workers they cannot go with a green economy simplistically anymore. They're not happy about that, about Biden's agenda proposing electric vehicle development, because they're saying, what about us? We went through deindustrialization. So many people lost their jobs. So we're sick and tired of empty promises that will be taken care of. And in some ways, I feel like there's a possibility that the UAW might do something interesting, which is take a stand against Biden, which they see as also taking a stand against the corporations and the auto industry that has failed them. But I hope I got at some of the major points of what we're seeing with the summer of strikes, which we'll have to see unfold. But maybe, Doc, you can clarify some things, or I just feel like you're clearer than I am.
No, not at all. I mean, Emily and I have been kind of talking about this for a couple of weeks, especially the situation with the Amazon labor union, which is in a plant, I think, that employs close to 7,000 workers. Is that right, Emily?
I think it's 8,000 workers.
How many?
It's 8,000 workers in just
8,000, yeah. So it's a huge plant. There had been two other major efforts to organize Amazon plants, one in Alabama and one in Buffalo, New York, both of which were unsuccessful. The company was able to split the workers, and this is a big question in all industries, in the auto industry, in the Teamster industry, and in Amazon. The mix between part-time workers and full-time workers, and a two-tier wage system and benefit system. And, you can readily get a job in a lot of plants, but they're only part-time jobs. And the company will hire you, and they'll say, but, we promise you, if you're a good worker for 3 months or however long, you can get a full-time job, and with full benefits and the wages of full-time workers. But every worker, every union knows that part-time workers, lower wages bring down the wages of everyone. And I think, Emily, did you tell me this, that over 50% of the workers in the Amazon plant that was organized in Staten Island, 50% of them are part-time?
No, that was UPS.
Oh, that's UPS.
Yeah, so actually I didn't see a straight up number, but it is a majority of UPS workers are part-time. And one of their primary demands for the new TA was they wanted currently there's a what's it called? A minimum, they work around 3.5-hour shifts and they want more hours. Because there are people who work part-time they're part-time workers for over 10 years and never get promoted to full-time. But actually back in 1997, the last time UPS started to go on strike like this, it was estimated by a researcher that all the new jobs being added to the UPS was around 80% of new jobs were all part-time.
Yeah. And by the way, what is the estimated percentage of workers at the Amazon plant in Staten Island who are part-time? This part-time two-tier wage system began in the auto industry back in the 70s. And the labor movement has not found an adequate answer to this problem, because workers do not like a two-tier wage system. Workers don't like it, the rank and file. And that is one issue. For 40 years now, workers have been prepared to strike over the two-tier wage system. And that was the key issue in the UPS strike. And even though what got all the headlines was, well, now all the trucks will be air conditioned and some other, work condition issues that seem to have been resolved in favor of the workers. But the key question of the two-tier wage system that's built upon this huge, over 50% of the workforce being part-timers, which means that these are people that work 2 and 3 jobs. They go from UPS to waiting or bartending or whatever else kind of job, and to make ends meet. So when they asked for 20, and it was not the part-timers alone, it was the rank and file saying raise the wages of the part-time workers to $25 an hour, and that was a compromise because I think full-time workers are somewhere around $30 an hour.
No, full-time is $49 an hour.
See what I'm saying? So oh wow, with full benefits. Part-time workers don't have full health benefits, And like you say, Emily, people can work for 10 years as a part-time worker, and it becomes normalized. But the rank and file who know that as long as the company has the right to hire all of these part-timers, there'll be fewer full-time workers. And that is in every industry, including the auto industry. Now, with the UAW strike coming up, the auto industry having been deindustrialized and now being introduced new robotic and artificial intelligence, mean fewer and fewer auto workers. There used to be a time where the UAW, every time a contract came around for the whole industry, they would choose one company to strike against. So let us say this year they struck against Chrysler. The next time a contract comes out, the negotiation or the strike or the threat of a strike would be against Ford, which meant that the workers who were not on strike would still be contributing to the strike fund. And the UAW had one of the biggest and most significant strike funds. So if workers went out on strike, they would still be getting an income. But now, 150,000 workers, which used to be even a small part of the workers in one of the corporations, in Ford, for example, over 1 million workers, or approaching that. So Ford went on strike, which would hurt Ford, but the other companies know that it'll be your turn the next time around. And workers, because of the strike fund, because of the benefits paid into a medical thing, so people didn't lose their medical benefits, workers could go on strike and be militant and strike as long as necessary. That is not the case now. Now the UAW is negotiating with the entire industry. Chrysler, Ford, GM, and Toyota, whatever else is here. I don't even know if the Japanese automakers are organized, you just don't know. And even with that, only 150,000 workers. A much reduced and much weakened population for the union. The other thing is that in the face of deindustrialization, and to his credit, Martin Wolf points out that deindustrialization is one of the reasons for this wide inequality in the society, where workers have laws. And that's why the UAW agreement is met with such anger and disappointment by rank and file workers. And a lot depends on the quality of local leadership as to the expression of anger and discontent and people saying we're going to vote not to ratify this contract. Well, we know the leadership is going to win. But the question is, by what percentage? How many people vote against it? And all of this comes, the so-called summer of strikes comes on the heels of the spring of crushing another huge union, which is strategic to the economy, which is the railroad workers. Biden crushed that. And people have compared what Biden did to the railroad workers in the spring to what Reagan did to the air traffic controllers in 1981, where he literally decertified that union. And up to this day, and I don't know for certain, I don't know that a real union has been reestablished among air traffic controllers since that time. And here, over 40 years ago. That was a serious blow to organized labor. I don't say everything goes together, but there has not been, in 40 years at least, a serious organizing drive of the unorganized. This is why, while organized labor has given billions of dollars to the Democratic Party, especially in national elections, I'm talking billions of dollars, as the very party that they gave this money to, all of this to run elections, while that same party was in the forefront, not alone the Republicans too, but the elite pushing deindustrialization. And that's when you go to Ohio, when you go to Western Pennsylvania, when you go to West Virginia, all over the industrial heartland of this country. Workers are angry, they're in rebellion, and the interesting thing is, and this is how it relates to the politics of the 2024 election. Workers have had their hands tied when they tried to express their militancy through their unions. It is, it's a bitter experience. Most workers, they feel almost the same way about a lot of their union leaders as they feel about their politicians. They don't like them. Now, at the local level, it's a different thing. Like you go to Western Pennsylvania or parts of Ohio, West Virginia, where the local union leadership is closer to the workers, where, I was seeing one thing where a local union used to have a union hall and a big meeting space for 200-300 workers. Well, today, that previously local union hall is now shared by 3 locals in the area, because all of them have been diminished. And the working class is being hit so many different ways at the same time. I mean, it's just, really, when you think about it, I guess what I think about most is the ideological attack upon the working class, literally when it is down. And that's what pisses me off. So what they did at Amazon plant in Staten Island was so extraordinary, 8,000 workers. That is huge. That is going back to the 1930s with the organization of industry, when you had these sit-down strikes and in steel and auto and other industry, electronics, electrical, where huge plants, industrial plants, were organized from the grassroots up. And that's what Chris Small and his friends and colleagues did. And now they're coming under what could only be considered an attack from forces within the union, who one must say must be connected to the company. And Emily has helped me to understand this, which I very much appreciate, Emily. What Chris Smalls and them are saying, we have a certified union. The next step is to get a contract. And that means a long, drawn-out process, sadly. But it means holding the workers together. Just because workers have a union doesn't mean they're ready to go out on strike. Especially when the company has divided the workforce between permanent and part-time, with so much being different between them. So the full-time workers have more of a stake in the union than many of the part-time workers. And most of the workers are young, which means that, they're in a sometimes transitory or fluid period in their lives. A lot of people who are young look at part-time work. All I want is a part-time job. You know what I'm saying? Well, you say that now. But what about if you want to buy a house, if you want to get a good apartment, if you want to get married, if you want to hook up, if you want to have a kid, whatever. If you want to have what sometimes is called a normal life, part-time work ain't what you want. You want a full-time, stable job with a guarantee of wage increases that don't just keep up with inflation, but make it possible for you to make some gains, to have more this year than you had last year, to do more for your kids and your family this year than you could last year. So what may have seemed, oh, it's hip, I got a part-time job and I drive an Uber on the side and I'm making it, I'm doing that on the weekend, I party. smoke my weed, and so on and so forth. Yeah, you could say that now. But at some point, the rubber hits the road. Life gets serious. And so Chris Smalls and them trying to keep the two lifestyles, if you will, together. Then you got all these young workers who know very little about the history of labor. And I don't blame them. I blame the labor movement that does not politically educate not just their members, but the whole working class. These guys that sit on their asses, 24/7 and get fat and drunk and have lost touch with their membership. So the more I learn about what Chris Smalls and them did, it's quite extraordinary. It is something that has not happened, and I could be wrong about this, in the ranks of the American working class for maybe 60 years or more. And him showing how to do it as a grassroots movement of workers, and he representing them. You know what I'm saying? The way he dresses, the way he talks, the way he is. They see him as somebody like themselves. And he is. He is. Extraordinary story. For a long time, I didn't know how to take him. I thought, but I see him as a very serious man and a highly intelligent man, as a strategist, as a tactician. You know what I'm saying? Highly intelligent. It's like learning on the job, but that steep learning curve, he has surmounted it. My heart goes out. I am so proud of him. And he was fired. So he doesn't have, so he has to raise money to pay his own salary. They don't have a strike fund at all. They're getting advice from everywhere and everybody, and all of the advice ain't good advice. You know what I'm saying? So they have to listen, but then make their own judgment about what to do. And that's what we see that's what I see him doing. Now, the Reform Caucus. And here we are. And this gets us to Emily's upcoming essay on Trotskyism. What did we say, Emily? What did we say we're going to call that? What was our suggestion?
It was, I think, Trotskyism, a warning sign for the young generation.
That's it. A warning to the young generation. Don't make a mistake. Don't go out on that limb. Because sometimes you go so far out on a limb, you can't come back. If you dig where I'm coming from. Don't make that mistake. And so here we have it, a Reform Caucus. Now, the majority of the workers in the plant are black and brown, which is only to say they share common experiences of lack of opportunity. They come from families where poverty is multi-generation. You get, believe me, there are families that all they have known is poverty. Every generation is poor. For black people, that goes back almost 20 generations to slavery. Families that have never known anything but poverty. You see what I'm saying? So when you say black, that is a way of indicating poverty and lack of opportunity. So they bring that. Chris and them bring that to the table. They have never known anything but poverty and hard times. And the way they fight is based upon that life experience. You understand what I'm saying? Just like Emily told me, I thought it was so interesting that Chris Smalls and his colleagues would be outside the gate as the workers would come out or go in, and he would be giving out food and weed. You know what I'm saying? I guess to work in places you need something to, chill you down a little bit. But that kind of approach to organizing and winning the trust of the rank and file workers you can only have that approach if you know the generation that is the workforce, and if you have sympathy with their lifestyle and you're not judgmental about them and so on. It's very, very interesting. But now you take the Reform Caucus, overwhelmingly white, right? This is very significant, who are challenging Chris Smalls on a whole number of issues, including they don't like the way he talks, they don't like the way he dresses, they don't like a lot about him. I'll put it that way. There used to be James Cleveland, the great gospel singer and conductor. He used to have this thing: they don't like you because they just don't like you. When people don't like you, ain't nothing you can do to make them like you. Chris could bend over backwards and start talking like a white person, and they still wouldn't like him because they don't like him. They don't like anything about him. And it is they who came not organically from the rank and file. They came into the plant once they saw a union organizing drive that seemed to be successful and have the support of, 8,000 workers. That's huge. To organize that, you have to take your hat off to those people. Organization is hard, especially going up against a company like Amazon that has all of these PhDs graduating, I'll say Cornell and other places, Penn, in labor studies or how to suppress labor studies. So you're up against all of that. You don't know where everything is coming from. And then you decide we'll have an independent union. We can do this ourselves. It's extraordinary. So you get leftists, and this is not new, who come into a situation after the train has left the station. In other words, after I done did all the hard work, got myself fired, now y'all gonna come in and y'all are the representatives of labor. Now what is their basic demand? And they see this that bad faith. It'd be one thing if you came out and said, "Dig, man, I disagree with you because I want to hold a strike to get a contract and you don't." But no, I don't come out like that. I come out and say, "You're an autocrat and I'm a Democrat." Okay, now you set up a ruling class binary. Autocracy versus democracy. And who better to be a symbol of autocracy and anti-democracy but a black former rapper who smokes weed publicly? But we, radical socialists and communists who only smoke our weed in the house, you know what I'm saying? And, that whole book, how you can demonize and smear somebody. So they thought Chris Smalls was dumb, and that was part of their thing. He ain't as smart as we are. And turns out he's way smarter than that. And you read his shit. His assessment of the labor movement at this time is on point and brilliant. And I'm trying to figure out, how did he learn all that so fast? Me and Emily talked about, how did he learn it so fast and understand it so clearly? That the problem at the Amazon plant is not just an Amazon plant question. It is a problem of the labor movement's inability to organize the unorganized workers. And in fact, he says, I think, or implies it, we have been sold out by so-called progressive politicians and labor leaders who are all on the same side. This Reform Caucus, and again, and you don't have to know what organization each and every one of them is from. One thing is as clear as day. It is what I see as out and out and cold-blooded Trotskyism. See, you guys never experience. I talk about it like I'm talking about a family member that went astray, because I kind of know it from experience. You know what I'm saying? Here's their deal. You start something, they enter it, insinuate themselves in it with the intent, and Chris Small said this, not of helping the workers and the organizing drive, but ousting the leadership of the organizing drive, replacing them with my people, and recklessly forcing workers into a no-win situation. No-win because you can't hold the workers together on the platform they want. In other words, to say to the workers at Amazon, we want to oust Chris Small, because he's not democratic, we want elections, even though the Constitution of the Union said no elections until after contract. We want an election, right? And that's democracy, you know. Election means democracy, right? That's one of the biggest frauds ever perpetrated by the ruling class. Oh, America's a great democracy. Look at we have elections every 2 months for something. You know, and the more elections we have, the more undemocratic the country becomes. So election means democracy. The contract, the Constitution of the Union says no election until after contract. Why? Because an election would be a distraction from the contract. But why do they want an election? Because they want to oust Chris Small. Now, y'all come from the outside. You weren't there from the beginning, right? You're self-proclaimed communists and socialists and radicals, which means you came from outside. That's no problem for them, because their assumption is the workers are too dumb. Class consciousness has to come from us. We, with our college degrees and our grand theories, we will tell the workers. So oust the leadership and put us in. But what do they want to do? They want to immediately take the workers out on strike for a contract. That's not what the workers signed up for. And now with you all, I'm not talking too loud, by the way, with you all splitting the workers, and they claim to have gotten 800 signatures on a petition calling for immediate elections, you know, which is a splitting tactic if I've ever seen it. It's almost like what they used to call a color revolution. You know, color revolution, overthrow somebody and say, oh, it was a democratic revolution. Like in Ukraine, they had about 3 or 4 color revolutions before the 2014 coup, right? But everything was democracy. You know what I'm saying? And all we want is election. Hong Kong, the same thing. Everywhere. Oh, all we want are elections, right? These people are doing the same thing. But then they have the audacity to take the union leadership into federal court. Well, the ship was thrown out. It didn't have a basis, but took them to federal court. In other words, it's like we used to say, you going to take me to the white man? That's what you doing. You supposed to be down with the workers. Why are you taking me to federal court? And this is where I think your essay, Emily, a warning to the young generation. These are not revolutionary tactics. Inherent to this is racism, a lack of respect for organic Black leadership, assumptions about their character, their intelligence, and so on. And so maybe this will be part of the final nail in the coffin of this iteration of the so-called left. They are all frauds and sellouts. But that is Trotskyism. And frankly, a lot of people say, well, I'm not a Trotskyite. But let's be real, money. Your default position on everything is a Trotskyist position. Split the working class, split the movement. That's one of the signatures of Trotskyism. Always split the movement, because you argue this great movement will go nowhere unless we socialists are in the leadership of it. Well, wait a minute. The workers voted for these people. Well, how you gonna come in and say, well, everything would be better, the workers would be better off, because I'm going to teach them, you're going to teach them class consciousness, although you just got out of college. You get this, you see the drama. So, I agree with you. I mean, I think the summer of strikes is not really a summer of strikes. Maybe the most militant one is the Screen Actors Guild. Maybe. What happened with the Teamsters does not bode well for organized labor. The fact that only 10% of the working class are unionized, that means 90%. And if you take private industry that is outside of government jobs and shit, only 94% of workers in industries are unorganized. So this is, and workers see it, the contradiction between what Biden says, the most pro-working class president in history. This is what social democrats say. This is what members of the Communist Party say. The most pro-labor president in the history of the country. They said, well, maybe since Franklin Roosevelt. Pro-labor. Take his CHIPS Act. Okay, this is supposed to be reindustrializing, or the, what do they call it, anti-inflationist bill. Supposed to be reindustrializing or greening American industry. No guarantee of unions, no guarantee of a single wage level. Just the whole damn thing is anti-worker and anti-labor. And who understands it better? The working people. And thus the rebellion. And see, this Trotskyite, so-called communist, so-called socialist cabal in the Amazon plant, poll them, ask them, and they're all pretty much following the narrative for the 2024 election. Can't talk about nothing, can't be independent of the AFL-CIO and that leadership, because that means that you're potentially anti-Biden, pro-Trump. And it's clear that on many levels, Chris Smalls and his colleagues and the majority of the workers that follow him are not feeling Biden. They're politically independent. They're not going to be told, or they're not going to have their union used to reelect AOC or Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden. They're not going to do it. And it's the more you look at that Amazon thing and then you connect it to the sellouts at the UPS, and I think it was a sellout on the fundamental question. And then you look at Joe Biden's crushing the railway workers' strike. You know what I'm saying? And 150,000 auto workers up against an industry like the auto industry. I mean, they're not going to go. I don't think they'll go out on strike, and they'll basically accept whatever the company gives them. We are not yet at that period where in the plants and in the industries, workers are in rebellion and organizing. The rebellion is outside of the workplace. You know what I'm saying? Not in the workplace, except what Chris Smalls and them are doing. And you see how that has come under attack. That's all I want to say, Emily.
Yeah, if I could say, I think this is very significant. I didn't fully realize the significance until Doc and Emily had sent me some information about this lawsuit and also the things that Chris Smalls has been saying. And I totally agree with Doc that Chris Smalls' statements and actions have been very impressive and very sophisticated. I actually, and one interesting thing is that after I think the ALU was organized, he was like a lot on the media. I think he went to the White House, met with different politicians, but it seems that he refused to buckle to whatever kind of pressure they put on him to basically sell out. And similarly, it seems like they've refused to join any major union in order to maintain their independence. I was just looking at an article which was written in the Insider, Business Insider, and it's also very revealing because a lot of the article seems to be an attempt at character assassination. They were showing video of a fight that he had. Actually, another former disgruntled employee or something attacked him, and he was defending himself. And this was back in December, but they're writing about it basically in order to try to, it seems like, portray certain stereotypes, like Doc was saying, about this young black man who's organized, show that he's unruly, unstable. And they have all these comments from anonymous sources or inside sources in the union or whatever who are making similar statements. And in this article, and in also the interview that one of the Reform Caucus people did on this channel Status Quo, they're emphasizing, our Reform Caucus, it's not all white people, it's people of color and queer people. And so that queer thing is being weaponized to cover up the fact that it's, these a lot of these white leftists involved in this thing. And also the other interesting thing is that the union, part of the reason that he's traveling so much, is one of the reasons the Reform Caucus is criticizing him, is because it's an independent union. They have to continuously raise money in order to pay their expenses, like Doc was saying. And it's interesting that their biggest donation or biggest source of fundraising has actually been GoFundMe. People just directly giving them money on GoFundMe or through this thing Twitch, which is another social media platform. So it's a very different, seems kind of model of what labor can do. So it seems, I mean, the fact that there's this coordinated media assault, basically, I think in like 1 or 2 years, he went from being someone that was actually getting a lot of positive coverage in the media to now it's all out negative character assassination. And I do think it's tied with what Emily is saying, that there's a sense that he actually may be moving towards this triad of resistance and a true kind of populism. And so, of course, everybody going in that direction is being smeared as, it's no coincidence, authoritarian. I mean, that's directly from the deep state. So I'm actually I'm just very happy to fully understand the significance of Chris Smalls and the ALU, and I think that it indicates, the shift in the consciousness of the working class, and exactly like Doc said, that the left underestimates them and thinks that they're smarter, but this is the real organic movement of the masses.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I really appreciated the introduction, I think, from Emily and Doc, because I feel like, part of the confusing thing is it's like there's a lot of marketing and branding, I think, around the labor stuff. And I feel like it seems like a lot of it is coming from the big unions too. And I think that has to be distinguished from what's actually happening. And I don't know. I don't have that much to say, but I just appreciate us going pretty deep into this because it's hard to get a sense of what's actually happening in terms of the labor unions, the labor movement, the actual workers who are involved in this, the rank and file. And I think I was looking into the UAW thing that Emily had mentioned, where I think it was a third of UAW workers had voted for Trump in 2016 and 2020. And I feel like the way that leftists typically would interpret that as to be oh, the workers are conservative or something like that, or that they're being pulled towards fascism or whatever. And I think it's more the way that we're kind of understanding it and interpreting it, where it's in this moment of crisis, emerging from the working class, there are many different political forms of protest, of movement, and that something like the votes for Trump cannot be seen as just workers being pulled towards fascism, but as an act of protest against the ruling elite, and them seeing the labor leadership as part of that, as connected to the Democratic Party and stuff. Because I didn't know that stuff about the electric vehicle, the plans for that, and how essentially it would be a step backwards for labor in terms of there's no guarantees in terms of organized labor, the wages would be much lower, and there's also there would be no guarantee that the workers who are currently working on the I guess the gas fueled cars would even have jobs, because it would be different kinds of jobs that would be created for the electric vehicle stuff. And I don't know, I just feel there's a lot happening actually on the ground that I didn't know about.
Can I just say one thing, just a small thing? You see this outsourcing. So much of the work in the auto industry is assembling cars. In other words, the parts are made outside the country. At one time, if you went to a GM plant, a huge plant, there would be a steel foundry next to it. So the manufacturing process had a loop, but it was all in the United States. So, for example, in St. Louis, Missouri, you have an auto plant that made certain parts. In another place, in Youngstown, Ohio, let us say, different parts. And these parts would be shipped by regulated truckers who were Teamster members, not deregulated, where every truck driver is his own boss, his own, where their wages have gone down precipitously. But so this connectedness of all of these industries to one another to produce automobiles. Now, almost everything is produced outside of the country, and the car is assembled in the country, now increasingly using robots. So when you see a robot putting the car down on the chassis and all. Oh, it looks so beautiful. Well, yeah, it does look beautiful until you lose your job. And then, but this is the result of deindustrialization, of auto production, which is then connected to steel, which is connected to the electrical industry, just a whole ecosystem which collapsed under deindustrialization and hence weakened the working class and the United Automobile Workers Union, which used to be at the vanguard of progressive unionism, support of the civil rights movement, just the whole thing down the drain now.
Yeah, because the one thing I wanted to also say is it reminded me a lot of Black Reconstruction, where the labor, the trade union leadership, or like the kinds of unions and labor that Du Bois describes as like the white worker in terms of like the organized labor force at that time in America. It was like they did not want to see the kernel of the labor problem related to slavery, and that they refused to see this connection. And that part of what I really appreciated that Emily brought up was that it's like you can't understand the question of labor as something that is separate from all like the larger crisis of war and peace, and especially the crisis of the legitimacy of the ruling class. And that you have to see, like this labor, like the kernel of the labor problem related to this larger crisis. And the question is like, do you move towards that, or do you basically try to cover that up and say like, oh, this is just it's a smaller problem of just wages, of just like these things. And I feel like, I didn't know that much about Chris Smalls, but it's a good sign that that's kind of the direction that he's moving towards as well.
Yeah, because I like the way you phrased it, Doc, when you said the political rebellion is happening, the primary political rebellion is happening outside of the workplace, except for maybe Chris Smalls. And I feel like that's important because I also thought about the Du Bois thing where like an example is basically, even if you successfully take your workers out on strike, it likely today with this economy, but also like, and when we talk about the economy, we're not just talking about like unemployment numbers. We're talking about like a war economy, like deindustrialization, like stuff like the result of deindustrialization, that you will probably not get a contract that you want. And you also will not have the proper tools and leadership that can lead you to the contract you want. Like it's likely a no-win situation because of it's not because of just your a confined labor union, but it's because of the leadership's relationship to the broader crisis. I guess that's the point I wanted to make, and that's also why a lot of the workers are disenchanted with union leadership. Yeah. Even if they're happy about certain specific wins in a tentative agreement, overall, there's a disenchantment with union leadership because of their disenchantment with like the general crisis of legitimacy of the state and all the other like forms of leadership that are related to that crisis of legitimacy. And that's how I see it. Yeah. And that's also why it's also why a lot of workers, like, they may not be passionate about bargaining, but of course they're passionate about their wages, but they're not going to be passionate about the bargaining process or even maybe the strike process. But what they are passionate about is voting for Trump. Like that sort of thing, where it's like, because the political rebellion is happening outside the workplace, and the leadership not only do they not want to side with that political rebellion, but they will also do their part as much as they can to try to quell the political rebellion of their own membership, which they know they can't control.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly say that on the UAW thing, Trump on his social media app, Truth Social, he directly appealed to the UAW, saying that Biden was waging war on the U.S. auto industry through these crippling electric vehicle laws, and that he promised to kill them, and basically said that the UAW should consider endorsing him because they've held out from endorsing Biden. And so I think that's I mean, regardless of whether the union leadership does so, takes it seriously or not, it's a significant thing, I think, for the UAW voters, workers. And as Emily said, states like Michigan, the UAW rank and file, and I'm sure retired and former members were very important in delivering that state to Trump. And, you know, the only response Biden has is like, first off, Biden has been calling himself the most pro-union president in history, which is ironic given how he broke that railroad strike. And then in response to this statement by Trump to the UAW, all the White House said was, "Oh, Trump is the most anti-union president in U.S. history." And you see how this consolidation is happening, and it's really, I wanted to emphasize, very unprecedented how early all the major unions are endorsing Biden, especially given the fact that there's going to be a contested, even Democratic primary with RFK and Marianne Williamson and others. You would think that any union leader with any, you know, ounce of backbone would at least entertain a challenge, at least within the Democratic primary, one of the challengers. I mean, if you're not interested in Trump. So it shows you the situation. And sadly, even like progressive organizations like Coalition of Black Trade Unions, I think they have some connection with the Communist Party, I believe, but they've all basically are, you know, going on board with this Stop Trump, and just, you know, everybody pull out all the stops to support Biden and the Democrats so early in the game. So it's, you know, I'm sure all their members see what's happening.
If I could, if I could add a little bit more to this auto workers specific conversation, I've been following the developments of Tesla, given that that's the new EV and it's American, and I see the kind of the assault of on workers, auto workers through this. So, for example, I mean, this is supposed to be all great new American industry in autos, but so they have the most they have some high-tech factories that are mostly robotics, and is mostly engineers, a small handful of engineers working on the most highly technological components in stuff like Giga Texas. They made a new factory in Texas. I think they also have one in Germany, Giga Germany, they call it. And the only labor-intensive things that they want to do, that they want to build, you know where they're building it? They're building it in Mexico. They're building it in Nuevo León, Monterrey, which is a northern state in Mexico, where basically they're following the model of it's called maquiladoras that took place during the neoliberal reforms and deindustrialization, where they just work the workers ragged for the most menial, labor-intensive jobs, and that's basically the competitive advantage. And then they quickly ship it over to the north, these assembled products, which I've already seen this stuff happen presently with I think a lot of where my family's in Durango. There's a lot of Japanese automakers that use Mexican labor for assembly. So I think that there's definitely still have their targets on the strong American workforce. And second, I really appreciated this overall labor discussion. So I personally feel invested in it because at least, you know, what produced Edgar Barraza and Nathan, who's here with me, was my family was able to have a higher level of prosperity because my dad joined the Carpenters Union in Chicago. At the time, they allowed, I guess, people without green card or U.S. citizenship. They don't do that anymore, but they were looser and a little bit more useful overall, because this was before the 2007-2008 financial crisis. There was a lot of building going on, and so they were able to bring more people in. But it was really not. My dad saw that it was coming to an end quick for us, anyways, because just for him to get in, he had to do as many favors as possible to help the Democratic Party, as much canvassing and phone calls and whatnot and door-to-door knocking. And second, they were trying to get rid of anybody once they were past their prime in terms of physical age. They were going to work him ragged. and then just stop calling him once he got old. So he had to get out of there. And really, the benefit of the union was that in Chicago, at least, was they let people work in commercial projects, so like building stores and stuff like that. And even then, there was still always some undercutting, because they had some laws where even if you weren't a union company, if you paid them certain union wages for that project, then you could go around the union and just hire this company, and you probably have worse benefits than the union, no pension and all that. Which I don't understand how the union allowed this to happen. So yeah, even at least back then, what was a boost to my family, I guess, why I was able to go to good schools and get educated, was on the decline. I can't imagine it now, and I'm sure that this is only getting worse, as you have outlined.
People don't have more. I can.
I was gonna say something really quick. Or were you gonna read comments or? Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to also express my appreciation for this discussion, because I do feel like it's what a lot of people have been saying. Like at one point, Chris Smalls just entered the scene, and we were always hearing about like labor or like Amazon efforts to organize. And back then, we all wanted to root for something, but also like the efforts just seemed to like bubble up and then collapse, and then you just didn't know where things were going. But I appreciate us being able to not only put together this discussion about that distinguishes all these different forces related to the crisis at hand, the crisis that I think the American locate the agency in the American people, but also with this historical perspective, and to truly understand what's been going on. And I just want to say that I'm really also more and more understanding the role of Trotskyism too, and know that like there's just so many young people watching these events unfold that they too want to bring a union into their workforce, even if it doesn't really like the conditions aren't really there to really achieve success or victory, because what they're seeing as a struggle is not really like obviously the workplace is a very important like arena, but really it's in the broader political sphere. And I just appreciate us also fleshing out the discussion through the auto industry and the UAW, because one of the ways that I know that a lot of us came into reading more or learning, well, a lot of us started reading Grace Lee Boggs many years ago, and her time in Detroit, her time with James Boggs, like Jimmy Boggs, and wanting to understand what that era of organizing and struggle, like both what it represented, the struggle of labor in the North, but also what has happened since, in terms of what has been the effects of like deindustrialization and automation on what could have been these organic movements, be they beset with questions around Black power or all these different tendencies, before all of these bigger forces cut that short. And I remember reading actually many years ago a publication from Jimmy Boggs called Pages from a Negro Worker's Notebook, something that also, I think it was published in 1963. And all that's to say, I could read a few things because I feel as if like where like those workers were thinking, or like Jimmy Boggs was thinking, his thinking also, I think, was anticipating what automation was going to do to not only the struggle for labor, but also for human rights, or like social relations in the American sense. Or even his last chapter is titled The American Revolution, and he very much talks about the notion of taking like the American people now with the rise of automation, and even he connects it also to imperialism. And he very much, it's like what Eddie, you were talking about, he knew that like the way that factories were to change in this new age would be that the rise of automation in relation to the war agenda and in relation to imperialism, if I hadn't said that before, would very much affect the American workers, so that the next struggle would not be so much in the traditional organized labor sense. I think he was distinguishing things from his first few chapters are about the rise and sort of decline of unions in the 30s. He pointed to a very different struggle to come. And I don't want to read too much because I do feel as if like what we've been doing to study also Du Bois, I think, is very much more in line with this, or gives us, I think, a broader sense of things. But if it's all right to just read a little bit, yeah, he has this chapter where he sees the effect of he calls it the outsiders, like after that book, of young people who are lost and don't have a purpose. And he sort of says like the outsiders are people who unemployment is almost inevitable despite how much like training, schooling that they can achieve. So I'll read a little bit if that's okay. For the outsiders who have never been and can never be involved in the system meaning employment of organized labor, regardless of how much free enterprise or initiative they show, automation means something much deeper. It means they have to find a new concept of how to live and let live among human beings. A new generation of this workless people is rapidly growing up in this country. For them, the simple formula of more schools, more education, more training is already outmoded. We already have with us a generation of youth who have completed high school and have had some kind of training, yet have found no mode of production into which they can fit. Because as fast as they are trained for the higher technical stage of production, just as fast does a new technical revolution take place. Whereas the old laborers used to hope that they could pit their bodies against iron and outlast the iron, the new generation of workless people know that even their brains are being outwitted by the iron brains of automation and cybernation. To tell these people that they must work to earn their living is like telling a man in the big city that he should hunt big game and meat for the table. This means that the new generation, the outsiders, the workless people, now have to turn their thoughts away from trying to outwit the machines and instead towards organization and reorganization of society and of human relations inside society. The revolution which is within these people will have to be a revolution of their minds and hearts, directed not towards increasing production, but towards the management and distribution of things and towards the control of relations among people, tasks which have up to now been left to chance or in the hands of the elite. Yeah. I think it's just something to think about. I do feel as if Jimmy Boggs may not have really anticipated the true effects of deindustrialization, the true effects of but there's certainly a few kernels there.
Okay, I can read a few comments if that's okay. So we have a few people saying good morning: Todd Doherty, Christopher Romero, Stephen Palmier, Jacob Carpenter saying good morning from Los Lunas, New Mexico, Ware Pilgrim, a few other people. And then DJ Elf says, I got to hang out with Starbucks workers in Philadelphia recently, and says there is more focus on corporate labor versus government labor. Only some labor struggles are being celebrated. And also asks about, what happened to the train workers, which Biden broke that strike, and what about that? And says that, I think referring to the Amazon labor union, that it can only be successful if it provokes a larger movement. And then says something about the opposition of Chris Smalls or opposition to Chris Smalls. And then, let me see, Danny says that it is not incorrect to say that a tight labor market is preferable to unions. That's why there was also a labor surge in 2018 and 2019. The tight labor market is not because of Biden, but rather because capitalist politics are opportunistic. It claims responsibility for things that it didn't do. A lot of the striking, one could say, is because of the inflationary policies of the Biden administration. Labor is trying to catch up for the fact that almost everyone saw real wages fall in the last few years because of inflation, but it's also related to the job market, in which consumer staples, companies like Target, Walmart, Coca-Cola have recorded record profits because they've been able to pass price increases onto the working class. So in other words, basic living standards have fallen, and so the slogan of "Fight for 15," which used to be considered a more serious demand 10 years ago. However, contract wages have since been inflated, hence the demand now for $25 an hour. And then says that the new SAG president, or the Screen Actors Guild president, Fran Drescher, called Bernie Sanders a quote-unquote shill for Billary, which I think is a quote for Billary and Hillary, or Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton. Basically called Bernie a shill for Bill and Hillary Clinton, and told Marine Le Pen of France to not forget the Paris Commune. Interesting fact. And then Todd Doherty says that the attacks on Chris Smalls are coming from a high-ranking member of the Communist Party and not the Communist Party itself. And then says that Smalls gives credit to William Z. Foster's book on organizing, although that may have been, I think Emily's saying that it may have been actually some of the CP USA people who were, I guess, attaching themselves to the unionization movement, who were, I think, citing William Z. Foster. And then,
but that comment is interesting though, because if you do a deep dive into Chris Smalls, it is interesting in interviews with him to kind of get a sense of his influences. Like when I haven't done enough to be like, oh, Chris Smalls doesn't list like whatever labor people from the past, but from me looking into Chris Smalls and stuff, he actually tends to talk more about how, oh, I got like my influence is the workers, or like my influence is the people, or my influence is my mom who was in a union. Like he says like, oh, my mom was a member of SEIU 1199 because his mom was a nursing aide, like, or she worked for a healthcare setting. I forget if it's hospital or nursing home, but he says like, because he was raised by a single mom in New Jersey, and he said she's the one, seeing her not even know that she was part of a union but paying union dues is what inspired me to maintain an independent union. And so I think that's interesting. Like,
yeah.
Whereas like the interviews that magazines have done with other Amazon labor union organizers who I'm assuming are leftists, like the person that Jeremiah was referencing, they will say like, oh, we were inspired by these books by CPUSA, Communist Party leaders from like the 1920s and 1930s. It's just it's an interesting sociological, I feel like for me, it was just interesting examining all these people.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And, William Z. Foster was a very great man, formerly the chairman of the Communist Party at one time, but a very great man who comes out of the IWW, the International Workers of the World, and here was probably the weakness of William Z. Foster. A lot of people say, well, I'm anchored to, I'm committed to the working class, but they have a very narrow definition of what is the working class in the United States. And I think Foster, although he wrote a good book, it's worth reading, called The Negro People in Our History, and he was very aware of the Black struggle and so on. However, he seems to always default to a kind of economism, that the class struggle is the economic struggle. And that was his predisposition coming out of the IWW and what we call anarcho-syndicalism, which in many ways was superseded by Leninism. Lenin probably presented the sharpest critique of anarcho-syndicalism and theories like that Rosa Luxemburg held of the general strike as the prelude to the revolution. I'll just stop there. A lot of things, and I think I used to hear Winston and others talk about Foster, and one of the things that they felt, and a great man again, but one of the things they felt is that he had this, well, first of all, not understanding the Black struggle properly, and defaulting everything to unions and to the economic struggle, as though the economic struggle would then, on its own, transform itself into the political struggle. What we see today is a political rebellion, which might and hopefully will affect a rebellion in the workforce itself, in the working class and in the plants and factories and so on.
Yeah, there were two comments from what we just said, Doc. There were two more comments that I actually want to respond to because I think I didn't make myself clear enough, which is where Pilgrim says that's an interesting dynamic, real life influence versus things like books alone. And then Christopher Romero responds and says, agreed, it reminds me of the connection between praxis and theory. One cannot rely on theory alone from what history shows us. I just wanted to clarify that I didn't mean to make it seem like experience versus reading or experience versus books, but actually I was trying to make a point about, because this is something I've been thinking a lot about from our free school discussions about the Black prophetic tradition, which is what I was actually trying to say with Chris Smalls and the way he talks about his mom is actually in some ways, I think, like, I'm not saying reading is bad. I think reading is good. Like, but it's what you're reading. It's what your knowledge framework is. That's what I'm trying to make a distinction about. Because William Z. Foster, great. His books, great. Theory, great. But what I feel like what I'm trying to point out, which is what Doc, you were saying with Henry Winston and future revolutionaries building upon William Foster, is that there's something missing. There's something missing in the way people are assessing or like seeing the world or struggles, which you do find in, say, Henry Winston, but not completely in William Foster, despite how important William Foster is. And I think it is the Black struggle. And I think there are certain assumptions that Chris Smalls may have, but that the people in the Reform Caucus do not have. I think it says a lot that I do think there are a lot of leftists or even young people who are interested in labor organizing or just like interested in changing the world, whatever. A lot of leftists, whatever, white leftists, I think they're the same. Like, there are a lot of leftists who take the 1930s seriously, but will not, for example, take the civil rights movement and all the labor organizing that was allowed to happen because of the civil rights movement seriously. And I think it's because they're not taking both the Black struggle, but a certain some basic philosophic assumptions or even political assumptions of that period seriously. If that makes sense. I don't know if I'm making that clearer. So I didn't mean to make it seem like Chris Smalls' experience, everyone else theory. It's more about like Chris Smalls from the grassroots, Black prophetic. I even think you get a sense of his humanism. Like there's something in there that I don't think you get with like leftists who are also involved in the Amazon labor union organizing, which is also why I think in the way they talk, there's a sense of there's an assumption that Chris Smalls is less smart than we are. Like, we understand political strategy. We understand the revolutionary path forward. We understand the path forward for labor that he does not have. And they actually simplify him to, oh, it's good that he's a Black guy. Like, he's a Black worker. He's our token Black leader. But they don't understand that actually he's highly intelligent and that actually perhaps he may have a reason why that facility is the only one that has succeeded, because he has something to offer, that he has leadership.
Can I quickly add a comment to what Emily's saying? Because I've been thinking about this a lot. this tokenism is also why you see figures like Biden and AOC and Bernie Sanders so desperately try to attach themselves to Smalls or to the ALU movement, because they recognize that it's ascending in some ways. But I thought it was very significant what Chris Small said at the Senate Banking Committee hearing, where he said that this is not a question of Democratic Party or the Republican Party, or it's not even a question of categories or labels like left or right. It is a question of workers and workers' issues, and these are the people who make up these companies. And so without them, these companies don't even have any existence. But it's a workers' issue, and the workers are suffering. And so no matter whether you're a Democratic Party person, or you better listen, because we are basically your constituency. So this is also, I think, I don't know if this is exactly, I'm trying to say that, this is not the language of so-called leftist and labor leaders. It comes from a place that's more fundamental and more rooted in people and in workers and their day-to-day lives and the travails that they face. And he has that. And I completely agree with what Emily was saying.
Or, okay, I guess one thing, maybe to make something also more concrete, is I really think this, the way we in Free School talked about, like, how seriously to take the Black prophetic tradition, like, do you see class consciousness in the Black prophetic tradition as contradictory and they need to be resolved? Or do you actually see the Black prophetic tradition as the very reason for class consciousness? Like why the civil rights movement was able to basically create such a broad working class movement, a broad movement of working people, poor people, starting with Black people, and then broadening it to something much, like, broadening it to even like white people and like whatever. And the reason why this becomes really important, even just on a very specific concrete level, is like, even at my union, it's what you're saying, Purva. There's a certain language. Like, it's basically the difference between, will you know how to actually move your rank and file in the way they themselves see themselves, versus are you trying to put something on top of them? Like, an example would be like, so many times, like, just from my like brief interactions with some of my own members, you will get Black workers who still see themselves in the tradition of Martin Luther King Jr.
Mm-hmm.
And that is not something, for example, a lot of union leadership would necessarily take seriously.
Mm-hmm.
But you will have members who say, like, my two heroes who I think about every day to keep myself going are Martin Luther King Jr. and Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, and then, or even the way that there are like white workers in more rural areas who their immediate sense of organizing is to say, like, oh, why don't we try to like involve our small rural community, their town of like 500 people. They'll say, like, oh, actually, we're not that concerned about wages because our wages are so not competitive because it's such an isolated rural community, that the thing we actually do care about is healthcare. Like the fact that people dip into their savings to get a mammogram every year, like something preventative and basic. And they'll say, like, oh, what might give us power is we're such a small facility of 50 workers. But what might give us power is that I know that my church will support me. Like, I know that my like deli will support me. It's like, I don't know, it's a different way of seeing like struggle or a movement or organizing than just simply going back to like a formula that maybe worked in the past or yeah.
It's kind of like I think Catherine Blunt has used this term a lot. It's like an overlay of like what the establishment wants, but then actually like what the people. And I feel like a lot of what like even you're describing and what is necessary is, instead of flattening everything, but to make it three-dimensional again. So like actually show that there are dimensions to this, and it can't just be like, oh, like labor as like one giant thing and it's all the same, and that all of the people who are like in the union leadership, the union workers, like all of them, that they're all basically on board. But actually there's like, there's a lot of dimensions to it that can't just be captured by this like overlay of like slogans and all that stuff.
Right. Okay, another example, I'm sorry if I'm getting excited. Another example in my eyes is Henry Nicholas, actually. the reason why I find him so personally inspirational, but also important, is that Henry Nicholas is a great example of example of a labor leader who never imposed, but took from the membership, if that makes sense. And example would be like, first of all, he left the Pittsburgh local because he said, I don't resonate with these people. Can you put me in Philly? I know how to organize workers in Philly because that's my people. Like Philadelphia is African American. I'm African American. We all see ourselves in the same revolutionary legacy of the civil rights movement. We think we need to fulfill it. We can fulfill it through like union organizing and it's not just like, you could see that it's not just about making the workplace better, but that Henry Winston understood them people not as just workers, but as like African American people, like with a great legacy and a great struggle to live up to. And like you can also see it in the fact that, for example, two examples would be, one is that his own membership, they oftentimes, or at least I saw in the newspaper, that they wouldn't just strike to get a contract, but they would strike for issues they felt important in their community. So Temple Hospital workers, like CNAs, clerical workers, they went on strike because they saw how many people were coming into the ER for drug issues, for needing services, and they felt so bad having to turn away those people who needed medical care but couldn't afford it, that the workers decided to go on strike with Henry Nicholas's support to say that we think that anyone who comes into this ER should get free care. It's so unfair to see people come into our North Philly ER and not get care. Like the workers were striking for that. And then the second example would be the Million Man March. That it's not a labor issue as in like a contract issue, but it's a membership issue because your membership is predominantly African American people, African American men who work in service and maintenance at these healthcare facilities, predominantly hospitals, who this is an important thing in their lives. It has everything to do with the worker. It has everything to do with the Black proletariat. And so Henry Nicholas, along with AFSCME DC 33 leadership, also a Black union, municipal workers, trash workers, sanitation workers, together they were able to organize the largest contingent, largest group of people to go to the Million Man March in DC. And so that's kind of what I wanted to give an example of.
And you're absolutely right. I mean, everything you all are saying is absolutely right. I would just add one other labor leader from Philly that is a part of that, and that's Lucian Blackwell, president of 1332 of the International Longshoremen's Association, who saw his role as a leader of a union as part of his leadership of a people and of the struggle for democracy. And W.E.B. Du Bois was his favorite author, and Souls of Black Folk was his favorite book. He was never anti-communist. I can tell you that from my own experience. The type of resistance that we, let us say, in free school face and our hesitancy to even approach some of these leaders and staffs of these unions today, who, are ideologically adverse to what we're about because they're so locked in to the Biden administration and the corporate wing of the Democratic Party, which I guess is the only wing of the Democratic Party. But just a quick thing on William Foster and his cohort that came into the Communist Party. These were extraordinary people. They were mainly Irish immigrants. And not just Foster, another man, Big Bill Haywood, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, Mother Bloor, Mother Jones. I mean, these were huge figures in the days, the beginning of the 20th century, late 19th century, of organizing workers in industry, where before the whole concept, the AFL concept was organizing workers by craft. So they had this idea of one big union, all industrial workers in one big union. Many of them, Big Bill Haywood, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, maybe Mother Jones, certainly William Z. Foster, became members and leaders of the Communist Party. And they went anywhere in the country where there was a strike, they would go to support the workers, do whatever they could to support that strike. And these were great people. However, you needed another level, just like you were saying, Emily, another dimension, another level. And so it is not enough to kind of hide behind William Foster and what he wrote, just like Chris Smalls talks about his experience and what brought him to see the world in the way he does. Well, William Z. Foster knows right the same way. They might not say their mother, but they're talking about their experiences as young people, as immigrants, as the children of immigrants, faced with a capitalist class who wanted to use them for cheap labor. However, you can't dismiss what is the defining moment of the 20th century in the United States, and that is the Black Freedom Movement. And labor, the progressive parts of labor, the most class-conscious parts of labor, understood that, including Henry Nicholas. I mean, he understood it so deeply in his heart, in his soul. The thing that attracts him to 1199 is that it was pro-civil rights. Nicholas wouldn't have given a damn about unionism if 1199 was not pro-civil rights. And let us not forget, Henry Nicholas is from Mississippi. The same thing with Lucian Blackwell. They're all that way. And you're right. And I knew Lucian very well. Lucian was very, very religious. You know what I'm saying? Which meant that he identified with that prophetic tradition. It's very, very profound and very interesting. But I agree with you completely. I think the form of leftism that is excoriating and trying to take Chris Smalls down is some out of control dogmatism and confusion and assumptions about things that they don't know a goddamn thing about, including William Z. Foster, and this idea that Foster is talking about the working class and Henry Winston is talking about black people. That was a big problem even in Winston's time. They had no understanding of what the class struggle is in this country.
I actually just wanted to make a small point about what Purva was saying a few minutes ago, where Chris Smalls said that this isn't about the left or the right or the Democrats and the Republicans. It's about workers' rights. It's about the working class. And I think that indicates a very high level of consciousness on the part of this person, who they're consistently underestimating. It actually reminds me of when Indira Gandhi took office. Everybody was saying that, oh, it's the first woman prime minister, and she just said, no, I'm not a woman prime minister. I'm just a person with a very important job to do. I mean, I think that is the level of consciousness that I associate with him as well. And it was really interesting that Purva and Emily and you also, Doc, said that Bernie Sanders and AOC sort of back in April, after the first vote on the Staten Island facility, they won that vote. And before the second vote on another Staten Island facility, they actually went down there to talk with the Amazon warehouse workers, and they participated in a rally, and they said no, everybody should support this, and workers have been oppressed for too long. And then the very next day, they lost that vote on the second facility, and since then, nothing. Since then, Chris Smalls has been fighting this battle against personal attacks as well as trying to hold this union down. And Bernie Sanders and AOC, which are, the Democratic Party's most left-leaning people, most pro-union people, came down once, talked to the people, and then nothing. Like I actually looked, okay, what have they been doing about the ALU since then, and I didn't find anything. So I think that really goes back to the point of these unions who are compromised are trying to make their members vote for the wrong people, misleading them, and I think that's just breaking their trust in the most despicable way.
Well, yeah, I actually wanted to read a passage from No Name in the Street by James Baldwin that what our conversation has been about has been making me think about, because I think this is also about how the labor struggle can become a democratic struggle, which is also a struggle to make America the last white nation. And I just think that also your analysis, like the framework that you set out, Doc and Emily, was really brilliant in explaining kind of what is happening and what the key contradictions are. But I wanted to read this passage because it follows on this idea, Doc, that you mentioned of how brilliant or how astounding and remarkable in some ways the analysis and the leadership of Chris Smalls is. And I just read this recently, but it's from the essay To Be Baptized in No Name in the Street. And it's when James Baldwin goes to Los Angeles and he describes what he sees in the ghetto of Watts and the young people that he meets there. He says, okay, if it's all right, I would just like to read this. But he writes, I've been to Watts to give high school lectures, for example, and these despised, maligned, and menaced children have an alertness, an eagerness, and a depth which I certainly did not find in or failed to elicit from students at many splendid universities. The future leaders of this country, in principle anyway, do not impress me as being the intellectual equals of the most despised among us. I am not being vindictive when I say that, nor am I being sentimental or chauvinistic. And indeed, the reason that this would be so is a very simple one. It is only very lately that white students in the main have had any reason to question the structure into which they were born. It is the very lateness of the hour and their bewildered resentment, their sense of having been betrayed, which is responsible for their romantic excesses, and a young white revolutionary remains, in general, far more romantic than a black one. For it is a very different matter and results in a very different intelligence to grow up under the necessity of questioning everything. Everything from the question of one's identity to the literal, brutal question of how to save one's life in order to begin to live it. White children in the main, and whether they are rich or poor, grow up with a grasp of reality so feeble that they can very accurately be described as deluded about themselves and the world they live in. White people have managed to get through entire lifetimes in this euphoric state, but black people have not been so lucky. A black man who sees the world the way John Wayne, for example, sees it, would not be an eccentric patriot, but a raving maniac. The reason for this at bottom is that the doctrine of white supremacy, which still controls most white people, is itself a stupendous delusion. But to be born black in America is an immediate, immortal challenge. People who cling to their delusions find it difficult, if not impossible, to learn anything worth learning. A people under the necessity of creating themselves must examine everything and soak up learning the way the roots of a tree soak up water. A people still held in bondage must believe that ye shall know the truth and the truth shall make ye free.
Jeremiah, you think we could go on to Oppenheimer now?
Could I make a final point? If it's
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
I wanted to talk about
I would like that.
Oh yeah.
the struggle for labor
We baptized.
and oh yeah, the struggle for labor and I guess the attack on labor and the attack on which is a partly an attack on the Black freedom struggle. Uh, Once again, drawn from my family's experience seen in Chicago. You know, my dad worked with a lot of different kind of people, but I did not see my dad work with a lot of Black people in the Carpenters Union. And when I think about deindustrialization, I think one of the few like technical jobs that require some strong manual labor with skill, I think, are the skilled trades. And I don't think it's a coincidence that today, at least in Chicago, where the conscience is particularly high, and there was a strong Black struggle for freedom. They did not want to have Black people in that union, and really. Overall, I mean, I understand why they let my dad into that union at the time when there was a construction boom. A Mexican over Black people from Chicago, because you have a more vulnerable population. You have yeah, that's willing to work hard. And when I especially think about the way that immigrants are positioned against labor, uh, the few jobs that seem to exist nowadays is more like service economy that doesn't really require as much skill and training. You can find somebody to do it, and you just pay them less, and it's more profitable for you. Uh, and which I think is the model now, because you have, I guess, the highly educated workforce, a handful of engineers and managers that dictate the global economy, and then you have the rest of the working people who are working a bunch of part times, driving Uber, DoorDash, delivery, and I talked to my. I think that's perfect for having a bunch of immigrants come in, especially Latin American immigrants, because it's so close because they've been impoverished. And I've been talking at least with my friend in Philadelphia. She's a Mexican immigrant, and she feels under pressure because the Hondurans are people from Honduras are coming, and they're trying to replace this already vulnerable labor force with an even more recent batch of immigrant labor. So the immigrants are stressed about the newer immigrants. It's not good. It's not good at all. Oh my gosh. So they're really coming for us. And with more service jobs, it's worse. It's worse. People are more vulnerable. A steel worker, at least you can't just take someone off the street and make them work the steel mill. So yeah.
The last thing I'll say, and I'm pretty sure we do want to move on to Oppenheimer, is the question of like, how do we get from where we are now to also a peace industrial economy? Like that's my only thought. Like that's what's really on my mind when I was thinking about all of this as well. I don't know whether it'll take the triad of opposition thinking about. I just don't know the Black. I just don't know yet. That's just a question on the table.
Well, I wanted to ask, did you still want to talk about Oppenheimer? Because we have also like the Martin Wolf thing, and then Michelle's essay, which I don't know if we can cover all three of those things today necessarily, but
I think we should do Oppenheimer because politics of the Cold War,
okay.
nuclear shit, and so on. Because I think that's the center of a great ideological struggle, really, the movie and so on.
Okay. Yeah.
And we can see if we can get to Raju's review and Michelle's review, and if we don't this week, we can get it next week.
That's also good because Raju said that he couldn't make Free School this week, but if we happen to do it next week, then he can be on Free School.
Okay. Well, yeah, I can start the conversation about Oppenheimer. I know a lot of people in Free School and in general, the American public has gone to see this movie over the past week or so, and I know that people have lots of thoughts, so I'm really excited to talk about it. I just wanted to say a few things about, I guess, my reaction to the movie and then how I've been thinking about it in the past few days. And I think I wanted to preface by saying kind of the main questions that were in my mind when I was thinking about this were essentially kind of broader questions of how we can think about art in general, which are essentially, first, like, what is the filmmaker or the artist actually trying to do in the first place? I think that that's important to try to understand or to have some sense of. And then, does the artist or filmmaker, to what extent do they succeed in that attempt? And then, like, the third question being like, but beyond, I think, the filmmaker themselves, like, what is the overall effect? Especially like amongst those who, like, the people who partake in the art, and is this whole project, is this endeavor worthwhile? Is it worthwhile for this time? So I wanted to say that I think the very first thing I'll say is that I like the movie. I don't know if everyone did, and I think that that's really good because it means that we can actually talk about it. I think at the same time it does have flaws, both stylistically, also thematically, and I can talk about that a little bit. But my main thought in relation to Oppenheimer is that I was surprised by it because it struck me as an actual serious attempt to examine very fundamental questions, which are essentially the responsibility of, in particular, the American people on the question of nuclear war and of nuclear annihilation and the larger question of war and peace. So an attempt to kind of examine that, the responsibility towards that. And then related to that, it was very striking to me how much it focused on science and the role of science in the ideological struggle, and placing science in the exact same arena as revolutionary struggles in art and politics. There's the early parts of the film were really interesting, I think, to a lot of us because, yeah, like essentially Oppenheimer says this. He's like, there's a revolution happening in the realms of politics and of art and all these places in the world. Why can't physics be part of that same revolutionary moment? And I think that, like, placing science as squarely in the mix of essentially the ideological struggle, the revolutionary struggle, I think that I was not expecting Nolan to go in that direction. And then the third thing that I was very, I was pretty impressed by was essentially a lot of the film examines the formation of the US deep state after the Second World War, and specifically through McCarthyism. But the last third of the film is, it's almost like more of a courtroom drama in some ways, but it's a courtroom drama that deals with what was this formation of the security state after the Second World War and its usage in the formation of the Cold War, of something that was not predetermined, but something that was actually brought into existence because of the actions and the consolidation of the US ruling class after the Second World War, which we've talked about a little bit. And so to that extent, that was kind of my interpretation of the film and kind of the questions that I was grappling with. And the thing is that I feel like all of those are questions that we in the free school think about a lot. And so in some ways, there were, especially in the parts of the film when, like, he's looking at works by Picasso and it's giving him inspiration to think about physics and the new quantum physics and all that stuff. I was like, whoa, like, it feels like this film was like tailor-made for free school in some ways. And so yeah, I think that was my initial assessment. But the other thing I want to say is that from my interpretation of the film does not treat Oppenheimer as a hero. And I think that many people are mistaken by saying that the movie in some ways like heroizes Oppenheimer, when a lot of actually the movie, the direction of it, it makes you question Oppenheimer and actually makes you angry with him in a lot of ways. And I think that was a deliberate move by Nolan. And I think that also there was a lot of concern about whether this movie would be a pro-war movie. And I think that it is not a pro-war movie. And I think that has to be said, which is, it does not glamorize war. It does not treat war as, it basically says, like, it implies that, first of all, the dropping of the bombs on Japan was unnecessary. Although Oppenheimer himself he's kind of ambiguous in terms of how he feels about it. But it also makes a strong point that the direction that the US went in terms of building this huge nuclear arsenal, which then provoked the Soviet Union to then need to develop their own nuclear weapons in response, that was an unnecessary thing. And Oppenheimer makes that point in the movie. And at the same time, so basically, like, the movie doesn't treat Oppenheimer as a hero, and that it also deals a lot with Oppenheimer as an ambiguous figure, an ambivalent figure in American and world history. But that my initial reaction to the movie and what I thought it did well, and I could be wrong about this, is that it showed that there were consequences to Oppenheimer's ambiguity. There were consequences to Oppenheimer's inability or unwillingness to take a clear stand, and that essentially Oppenheimer's fall from grace is simultaneously the product of McCarthyism, but also it's a product of his own ego and his own thinking that he will essentially escape the consequences of his own actions. And so I wanted to say that as well. And I think that, I know that there's been a lot of discussion online and in Free School about, in particular, the decision to not show directly the victims of the atomic bomb dropping in Japan. And I think that it's something that I'm not completely sure about, but I think my initial reaction to it was that in some ways, what I thought the film still did was to show that, again, like, even if it doesn't go directly to Japan, because the film is ultimately, for better or for worse, it's focused on the subjective experience of Oppenheimer himself. Like, the whole film was revolving around essentially the subjective experience of Oppenheimer, as well as maybe like the secondary character of Robert Downey Jr.'s character, that I think that the film still tries to show that there are these huge consequences to what Oppenheimer has done that he did not fully anticipate or understand, and that a lot of the movie is like it dawning on him the incredible consequence and weight of everything that he has done. And I think there's an argument to be had, or a discussion to be had about it. Does it actually do that in the most clear way, in the most successful way? But I felt that it was trying to show, like, the scene where, after, and I guess this is spoilers, but the scene where after he is giving that speech to all of the Americans at the Manhattan Project, and it's supposed to be a kind of triumphant speech about like, oh, like, we showed those Japanese, right? But instead, like, the overwhelming note of it is of horror. And it's I think that, I don't know, that was to me the strongest note of like whether or not Oppenheimer was able to come to terms with this personally. The film still shows like, no, like, you did something, you were part of something, whether you will acknowledge it or not. Like, you are part of something that actually has immense consequences for humankind. And at least that was my initial reaction to it. And I think the other thing that the film does is, like, the lead up to the dropping of the testing of the bomb at Los Alamos is not one of like, oh, triumphalism, like, oh, we did this by the dint of our own genius and all this stuff. But the overwhelming feeling that I had, and this is just maybe just my subjective thing, but the feeling that I had was a feeling of dread. Like, oh my God, like, they're actually going to do this. Like, this is terrible. Like, and because we know how the story ends, we know how the bomb gets used. Regardless of how Oppenheimer's initial goal of developing this bomb as a reaction to the Nazis, who are also developing their own atomic bomb. And regardless of his own intentions going into it, like, ultimately, we know as an audience know how it's going to be used. And so this is my, I guess, reaction to the movie, but the way that I see it and currently understand it, and I'm open to, I think, talking about this and seeing how we can kind of collectively think about this, but I feel like the film essentially has the chance to go beyond what someone like Christopher Nolan could have even envisioned or understood for this film in terms of its impact. Because essentially, like, the way that I understand Oppenheimer and focusing on Oppenheimer is that he's not a heroic figure. In many ways, he's a tragic figure. He's a figure full of contradictions. And that in some ways, Oppenheimer's face, when he's coming to terms with this enormous guilt that he feels and this enormous questioning of like, oh my God, what have I done? Is in some ways like that is America's face, because ultimately the American people too bear responsibility to the world in terms of what our government has done. And whether or not we were in the room where those decisions were made, ultimately the task of the American people is to accept the responsibility for this in order to actually build a fruitful relationship with the world on the basis of peace. And I think that my main feeling coming out of the movie is that I see it through the lens of the importance of seeing the possibilities that are raised through a film like this, regardless of even what someone like Christopher Nolan or Hollywood could have even envisioned or planned for, in the sense that ultimately, and this is a point that Albert Einstein brought up in the immediate aftermath of World War II, was that the question of nuclear weapons and of nuclear energy and the question of the atomic bomb and of where humanity was, that was a question that needed to be brought directly to the American people at the time. And instead, what he saw was like essentially this clamping down, the consolidation of the Cold War state, the consolidation of the ruling elite, in order to say, no, we like essentially only a small group of people in the United States can ultimately decide what is going to happen in terms of our nuclear policy, how we're going to relate to the Soviet Union, and that this was essentially an anti-democratic movement in the United States in terms of the how the Cold War came into existence in the first place. And I think that like in terms of critiques of the film, I think that in terms of the structure, it was pretty confusing at times. And also there were, even just like audio wise, it was hard to hear what people were saying a lot of the time because there's a lot of background noise. And I think people can also have different tastes in terms of how Christopher Nolan is using some kinds of stylistic stuff in terms of, like he'll cut away to like these very dramatic images of like sparks flying and like these waves. And I thought it was cool. It could be seen as others as kind of like overly flashy. Like I'm open to talking about it. And then also other people have brought this up, but like the particular usage of Einstein, like I agree with many people that was very inadequate, because Einstein was not just like this old dude who had kind of like retired and was, just like giving like mystic advice to the other physicists, like younger physicists, but actually he was someone who was directly involved in the world struggle. And he also had, his own views about the Soviet Union. I don't think he really fully agreed with the Soviet Union, but still he understood that the main, the impulse of what was dragging, sort of creating the conditions for the Cold War, all of it was coming from the United States and the US ruling elite. And I think that they could have used Einstein as a clearer voice rather than just like as kind of like an old head who they approach, but he doesn't really give that many clear answers and all that stuff. But yeah, I think that was my overall impressions of the film. And the last thing I'll say is that there's been a lot of very different reactions to the movie, not just within Free School, but also in terms of the broader cultural landscape. And I think this may be naive on my part, but my impression of the reason why many people are kind of going out of their way to praise the film, in terms of especially institutions of like culture, like the cultural elite, the scientific establishment, is that they want to smother many of the actual serious questions that the film raises. And I think that this is actually a common thing that I've seen with other films that I think are interesting, but then they get a lot of critical praise, and that this is essentially used to kind of smother any kind of real discourse that could emerge from a film like this. Just as an aside, Neri and I, as part of Free School, we went to a conference yesterday in Washington, D.C. that was about the chances for peace in the Korean Peninsula on the 70th anniversary of the Korean War armistice, which the Free School held an event about. And I only bring it up because Oppenheimer kept coming up in terms of the dangers of nuclear war. And I thought that was pretty interesting in terms of like it showed some of the limitations of the film, but also I think it touches on the real nerve right now in terms of the present Cold War moment, in which the threat of nuclear war is very real, and like far from what all of the experts and the elites will say about it, the impetus from it is coming from the United States and our ruling elite. And I think that discussion is what I see as the possibility to emerge from a film like this, although I could be wrong about that. But yeah, that was my initial, I guess, reaction to the film. And yeah, I'm really interested to hear what other people think.
Well, speaking for myself, I think I agree with Jeremiah. I was trying to understand actually why this movie, why now? And I think initially when I heard it was coming out, I was under the impression that I was really worried that this was going to be like a pro-nuclear war movie or something, and a total propaganda piece, anti-Russia propaganda piece. And so, but when, after I saw it, I realized, no, that's actually not the case. It's actually kind of warning of the dangers of nuclear war, or at least is critical of the nature of nuclear war, and had surprising stuff. Like, for the first time in many years in a film, I've seen some criticism, at least, of the deep state and of the U.S. role in the Cold War and that sort of stuff, and some positive portrayal of peace activism and even communists. Although, of course, there are definitely some weaknesses in the film as well, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But I thought what was interesting was, well, in terms of understanding why now, like, I felt perhaps one explanation is that for the first time in many years, the world situation is actually impacting filmmakers in Hollywood. Like Christopher, I don't know much about Christopher Nolan besides he made the Batman movies, but maybe the fact that now there is some serious discussion of the risks of nuclear war and U.S.-Russia confrontation is actually impacting people to even filmmakers, to look back at the origins of this confrontation and bring it into their art. So anyway, I just thought it was kind of refreshing to see an intelligent, at least, movie that was critical, somewhat critical and skeptical of the claims about U.S. history and the deep state. Although, of course, it definitely had some weaknesses that means I wouldn't characterize it per se as a revolutionary movie, but definitely one worth seeing.
Well, I've been thinking about the film a great deal since I saw it, and riding back from the film with Jeremiah and Nuri, and listening to their very sophisticated understanding of filmmaking, and really I had to just bow down and chill, and then I've been thinking about it ever since, and certainly about the Cold War. I guess one thing that keeps coming to my mind is that, wow, I wish Oliver Stone had made this movie. You know what I'm saying? And it's a story that has to be told. And it's a story that has not been told in any mass way. But then the next question for me is it a story that Hollywood can tell? Is Hollywood capable from a political, and even in terms of the way Hollywood sees the film genre itself? And of course, film is far more powerful than a book. And this film is based upon a biography of Oppenheimer, and I guess some other things too. But this is a story that has to be told. And how it is told is very important. Who tells it and who is able to tell this story? I think Nolan, whom I didn't know that much about, and really Nuri and Jeremiah opened my eyes. I didn't know any damn thing about him. I have to say I'm a little biased against Hollywood, and this goes back to the McCarthy period. And everything about Hollywood turns me off pretty much. But, and I would prefer to see a film from anywhere else but Hollywood. So when I go to a Hollywood-made, here we go, summer blockbuster, I already have a bad attitude and a bad taste in my mouth. I'm not going in there hoping to be pleasantly surprised. So I wasn't with this movie. Just in the term, if I could just say a couple things, and Jerry and others tell me if I'm wrong on this. He was obviously using various genre in the making of the film. The Star Wars, post-Star Wars kind of pyrotechnics. And I don't even know why that was needed. But wasn't that why we went to an IMAX theater, so we could get the full effect of all of that. And we were sitting right up in the screen, tell you the truth. But it didn't hurt your eyes. But, I mean, we got the full effect of the pyrotechnics. I don't know how necessary that was. Oh, by the way, he filmed it not digitally, but on the old way, on, what is it?
He filmed it on film, like 70 millimeter film.
Yeah, on film.
And there's no digital effects in the movie. It was all shot in camera.
Oh, okay, interesting. And of course, that will up the ability of the film, capacity of the film to get, what is it? Not Grammys. What do they get? Oscars and so on for effects and this and that and the other. Okay, we got that. But the other thing is, he uses film noir kind of techniques that go back to the French. And it occurred to me that so much of the dialogue in the period when, the communists were in Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, and they, and a lot of it you couldn't understand, and it wasn't to be understood. It's the atmospherics that he was trying to create. Now, why that was the case, I don't know. Then, so those are some genre technical things that he did. And I felt that in a film like this, every word is important. Every word from the mouths of every character is important and needs to be heard. But the film director, I don't think, agreed with that because it was not intended that a lot of that dialogue be heard. Then other choices, and I talked to Purba about this, the thing where his lover discovers that he is reading the Bhagavad Gita's in Sanskrit. Well, yeah, all that's good, but why you got to do it when they both just had sex? And I felt, and this is a requirement of Hollywood blockbuster films, that you have, titillating sex, moments. So if you fall asleep, if you doze off at one, then you say, oh shit, they're having sex. Let me wake the fuck up, And so, yeah. And then, when he was being interrogated, I mean, why you have to, it's just, it was just cheap bullshit to me. If you wanted to get into the unconscious mind and yada, 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 there's a way to do it and to be clear about it and not just to keep the audience awake. And I felt a lot of the pyrotechnics, they were very loud. So I know people, you had to fall asleep 3.5 hours and then all of a sudden, boom, oh, wow, I'm awake now. But that's that. I know that an Oliver Stone would not have played upon those things. And he would not have allowed Hollywood producers to force him into that. But then it's about the Cold War. It's about the scientists, and this is where I'm interested in Oppenheimer, and I think it was Purba that said, and I agree with this, that it's that first part that made all the sense in the world to me, that was so very interesting. This period, like you said, Jerry, where he says, quantum mechanics and the new art movements and the Russian Revolution and all of this were part of a single cloth. That the philosopher or the physicist, the theoretical physicist, was in fact a philosopher. And that's the way they saw themselves. All of this today is a result of the Cold War, which they don't make clear. The intellectual emasculation, evisceration of the intellectual and of the scientist. And that Oppenheimer was concerned with quantum mechanics when no one in the Anglo-American world, that is Britain and the United States, were interested. Um, they hadn't gotten far behind Maxwell's laws, or they barely knew, were interested in the theory of relativity, but certainly not quantum mechanics. And so he goes to Germany, and this is a great philosophical movement, really, which brings us up to where the free school is and what we're going to be doing with string theory. It is philosophy, theoretical physics as a problem for philosophy. But anyway, we can get to that another time. But I thought that first part raised so many great questions. And then World War II, the rise of Hitler. And let us not get it twisted. The initial impetus for the Manhattan Project was to get an atomic bomb before or around the same time the Germans got it. And for Oppenheimer and the whole cadre of Jewish scientists, it was to save the Jews. That was the main thing. And once Hitler and the Germans are defeated before the war before they get the atomic bomb, then Oppenheimer has to make the moral choice. What do I do with this device? So that's when I think the famous statement from the Bhagavad Gita is, I am death, the destroyer of worlds, or some people say the destroyer of time. And he says that in the spirit of Arjuna, I guess he's now seeing himself as a warrior, he will drop the atomic bomb on 2 small towns or cities in Japan as a demonstration to the world of what we should not do. So I'm going to sacrifice or martyr a few 100,000 people in 2 days in order to show to the world what should not be done. That kind of thinking represented, or I think showed certain things about him which were not explored, by the way. And now, so that second part, you get that second part, which is the Manhattan Project, all of these people who are communist or at least pro-Soviet, pro-democracy, and intellectuals. That's interesting. It tries to explore some of their social, sexual relationships, mental illness, and anxiety, and a lot of people who are eccentrics and don't fit in with the scientific establishment. But these young scientists had more or less risen to the forefront of science because they understood relativity theory, they understood the splitting of the atom, they understood what physics was about in the ways that the old mechanistic physicists didn't. Beautiful shit. Not made clear, however. Not made clear. I'm drawing this based on my own knowledge and context. So I'm saying the majority of people wouldn't even understand what was going on. Besides the problem of understanding what they're saying a lot. But then the third part, which is the early Cold War. And that is from 1945 up to, let us say, 1965. That 20-year period where the world was on the edge, on the razor's edge. And I think in the immediate sense, Oppenheimer is being criticized because his name was not dragged through the mud as others were. By the time, these various McCarthy committees and others go after him, Einstein is dead. And that's a huge political and scientific loss, and that kind of, but that early part of the Cold War, and this is where the question of Oppenheimer, and it's not clear. I mean, yeah, he was involved in a personal moral struggle, and it looked like he had had a nervous breakdown. He couldn't speak. And why that, and that committee's wife was saying to him, you need to speak up, you need to say something. Well, he literally could not unthink. He may have had a serious breakdown. But his name is associated as the father of the atom bomb. He goes down in history known for that. And so on. Let me just say, I'll end my thing on this. It's a Hollywood film. Hollywood was very much a part of the McCarthyite Cold War thing, promoted the Cold War for the most part. There was a film here and there. What was that film about the crazy Air Force general?
Dr. Strangelove.
Dr. Strangelove, yeah. That was, and actually, to tell you the truth, that was a more clearly anti-nuclear war movie than this one was. But I guess what I'm saying, I hear everything you're saying. It's anti-communist in the sense that we understand it as such, because we talk about this every week and every day during the week. So we have a context, we have an understanding. I don't think many people would have gotten that from the film, because remember, when they're showing that Cold War committees and all of that, they were going back and forth to a previous time. So it could easily be unclear, well, what is the situation? What is the time context? Because everything changed with the Cold War. And because he opposed the hydrogen bomb, this is why Edward Teller comes in and becomes the celebrity, and he is known as the father of the hydrogen bomb, and so on. But just in terms of today and today's politics, and that's where I think Hollywood is severely politically limited. Okay, it can talk as best it can about McCarthyism, and everybody now acknowledges McCarthyism was bad, which isn't a big thing 70 years later. But Hollywood is so implicated in McCarthyism that to tell the truth about it is to expose the Hollywood industry's part in all of this, which meant, and the whole anti-communism thing was to give a ideological cover for the U.S. attempt to rebuild the colonial world, and hence the world, based upon now U.S. as the hegemon, and without the British and French and Belgian empires, to build a neo-colonial world. And the Soviet Union was the block to that. Their solidarity with Africa, et cetera. We don't have to go into that right now. So, but they still, Curtis LeMay and others wanted nuclear war. They wanted to drop nuclear bombs on Cuba. They wanted to drop nuclear bombs on not just the Soviet Union, but China and Korea, and so on. And a lot of lives were sacrificed. Not Oppenheimer. His was a personal dilemma. But the Rosenbergs, who were not mentioned, they were executed around 1953. It's the same thing that was involved with Oppenheimer. They were accused of being spies who shared nuclear secrets with the Soviet Union. Husband and wife, never done before in this country, politically, for political reasons, executed on the same day. Unimaginable, untalked about, but it's a central part of this. Not to mention, all of the people who lost jobs, including and it kind of comes out, the undermining of science and physics. And American physics has not recovered from that period. It has not recovered. And then, of course, I always say the untimely death of Albert Einstein, who was morally and politically consistent. I guess one last thing I want to say. Now, I think the good thing is if the film could be used in classrooms and other settings to discuss what the film is trying to tell us and what is not being said and what needs to be said to understand the life of Oppenheimer. Well, that's all I would say.
So I wanted to say, like this is a very clarifying conversation. I think I was thinking of, in many ways, the film seems at the end of the day very incomplete in some sense, and I think I really liked what some of you were saying initially, the first part where this whole conversation about what science is, and I think you said, Doc, that these were not just scientists but philosophers, and they were trying, they were embarking on this quest for truth, this search for ideas, where human beings are supposed to move on from now, because that was the period where we were showered on with new new data, new experiments which nobody understood. So it was a very challenging time for humanity as a whole. And the first 30 years of the 20th century pretty much was the time where scientists and philosophers, they were all coming together to discuss ideas, and they all came up with many different not just many different theories but also different interpretations of theories and so on. And all of this really I think I really liked it because it showed that this was it tried to show the this period of revolution in physics as something which everybody is invested in. It's not just something for the scientists. It's everybody's business. But the thing is, it feels like Nolan himself, or people making the movie itself, did not really grasp the full magnitude of that, because once you talk about this seriousness of philosophy and the questions of philosophy that are completely tied up with the question of science and of scientists, I feel like you can't at the same time have that seriousness and then have a completely frivolous sort of flirtatious relationship with a religious scripture like the Gita, which is also the whole point of why you're bringing that up, why everybody likes to quote Oppenheimer's quote about the Gita and all of that, is because there is this sense that he was also embarked on this search for some philosophical understanding. And that was, I thought that was dealt with in such a way which showed that Nolan himself did not grasp the seriousness of it. And I think the reason I say it was incomplete is also this question, Doc, that you mentioned about Oppenheimer's persecution. Sure, I mean him being persecuted, the way the movie talks about it is how he was he at some point he was the most important scientist, and almost the most important public intellectual at a point. And at the end of the movie, it goes to the place where he's sort of showcased, he's awarded prizes and medals and so on, but nobody takes him seriously, or nobody takes his ideas about nuclear deterrence seriously, or anything like that. So that's sort of the extent by which the movie is trying to say that the McCarthyite persecution was. But yeah, there were several people who who suffered much more real persecution. And like even in the field of physics itself, even in the very field of new physics and quantum physics and so on, there are quite a few names of people who actually lost their jobs and so on because of severe McCarthy and anti-communist propaganda. Like one of the most popular names of that is David Bohm, who had a different interpretation of quantum mechanics, and he lost his job like multiple times. He was employed at Princeton, and he lost his job left and right. And even though even though he went to trial and it was proved that all the evidences charged against him, all the evidences were basically trumped up. Princeton was still unwilling to re-employ him because it was a question of the price that an institution also has to pay in order to take a stand. And these there were many examples very closely associated with Oppenheimer's life and with the whole question of where physics is in this whole political moment that we're talking about. None of that came up, and I think these are real examples which would which would strengthen the point that the movie is trying to make. All of this is related to the question of where how deep state was created, and how the deep state essentially it undermines physics, like you're saying. And towards the end, the thing is, I think I really wish, at the end of it, its focus was the effect of all of this on Oppenheimer's life, but the effect was far bigger, and you could just see it by the conversations that physicists have in the 1920s. And if you compare that with today, that is a comparison that is extremely stark. You can see the kind of questions and the ideas that people are trying to follow. They're trying to understand how to make sense of the world. And you compare that to a physics department today, it does not come close to it. It seems like a joke. And this is something I feel this is something. If you say this, if you make this point, if you try to make this point, it threatens somebody. I think it was Eddie who was talking, who was saying this when we were going back, that this movie doesn't threaten anybody. And I thought that that is it is an important metric to judge something in a movie about this time by, because it is trying to make a point. It is trying to talk about the deep state and the consequences it has had, but you can't really do it without threatening something. And I feel at this point, the university and academia in general, that is it's the easiest to be threatened, because they are the most compromised at this point, and they are on their bandwagon about how they are the progressive vanguard of humanity. But this is in order to come at this question, I think it's really important to evaluate where science is today, and you can't do it simply by looking at one individual's life. It's only a part of it. Yeah.
If I may add to the discussion, you feel like you tagged me in, my friend. The criteria for the movie, which is, does this threaten the ruling class in any way? Is this indicting of anybody right now, and does it give anybody any impetus, any power, any direction right now? My point of view, I don't want to drink the haterade, man. I drink water, but I think not. I really think not. Talking about, let's say, the national security state and the deep state, which is very strong on the minds of people right now because of Donald Trump. It seemed very powerful. There's been things released recently, like the Twitter files, which talk about the cooperation between the CIA and social media to suppress views, eliminate views. Some people get blocked completely. There's also shadow bans where they just don't show your stuff, even though you're allowed to post it. Nothing about the national security state of that day. That's just something in the past. That has nothing to do with us right now. And then, for example, what you talked about of the ideological dimension that science has taken. From my experience as well, I used to do experimental physics, any physics funding that you do and that you get behind the scenes is somehow tied to the military, either the Department of Defense, DARPA, the Air Force. It has to be somehow related to military applications, which I think probably was found. It seems to be foundational after the formation of the atomic bomb in the Cold War period, where the United States was the greatest military threat. I don't feel that that connection was made to today at all. And then I guess the ideological dimension of science, which I guess this one, I didn't expect them to make the point of, but I want to criticize it anyways, just because I think people have the responsibility. We talked about the revolutions in thinking of that time with the rise of the Soviet Union and art, and how that led to that kind of thinking made new ways of doing physics possible. Philosophy preceding that. I don't think that that connection was strong today, especially what we've talked about with string theory, and how that's an ideological position. I was not fully satisfied.
I'm just going to. I think most people have covered the points that I would make about the movie. I think I agree with a lot of things that Jeremiah started this conversation with. That it was a great thing to hear that a movie is being made about Oppenheimer and the invention of the atomic bomb, because it is appropriate. This is the appropriate moment for this discussion to be had and this story to be told. But I think personally, the mistake I made was to have almost like a expectation of this story being told in the perfect way that I would have liked it to be told, which is, I agree with Doc, just something that I don't think Hollywood is capable of delivering at this point in time. There were some, in fact, many things I could point in the movie that I think were good, and especially that first part, which you really, like everybody has been saying, really brings to life this idea that there was this sort of scientific revolution afoot. But I feel like there were so many opportunities that could be explored further in the movie that would really have made an impact on how people think about this question about war and peace in today's time. And I think that is really the criteria to judge a piece of, a movie or a piece of art by, is whether or not, it provides an impetus for change, societal change or transformation, and if it makes the moral and intellectual choices clear to the audience. But I think, because there is this idea that, you have to keep things a little more fluid, it has to be more open to, the audience to decide how they feel about certain things and so on and so forth. I think some opportunities were lost to make some very clear statements that have relevance for our times regarding war and peace, because we are literally once again at the brink of nuclear war. For instance, the moral dilemma that Oppenheimer faces after he realizes that his invention has been responsible for millions of deaths. I do agree that they did try to show it in some ways, in sort of the monstrous faces of the audience who were clapping when he was saying, "Oh, the Japanese, oh, we killed so many Japanese," or whatever. But I feel like I would have liked that discomfort and that moral dilemma to take a more central place and to be elaborated upon a little more, so that, people could also stew in that discomfort of what it means of having the ability to produce technology and science that has the capacity to annihilate all of humanity. What does it mean? And also, there's one thing that I think I'd mention is one of the points they try to make through Oppenheimer is that the scientists, even though it is their creation, they do not get to decide how their creation is used. And I think this is something that Oppenheimer says many times, or at least 2 times in the movie, and that suggested to me that this is a point that they were trying to push forward, that the owner of an idea or a technological innovation does not have a right to control its use thereafter. I personally don't agree with this. I think this is not a statement that needed to have pushed, because it really points towards, almost receding or retreating from the moral responsibility that as scientists and, I don't know, creators in general, you should be held accountable for. And I agree with the other thing that this thing that Jeremiah also mentioned about Einstein, is that he was sort of presented as this old man who was defeated, and he had given up. And, he says that really cynical thing to Oppenheimer that, oh, they're going to do to you what they did to me. But as long as, you're producing great science that is in their interest, they will applaud you, but then soon they'll turn against you. But I think this is just so contrary to the impression I have of Einstein, as even during the invention of the bomb, and after that he was writing and just talking constantly about how this is a choice that shouldn't have been made. And so he never really retreated from this. And as far as the anti-communism thing is concerned, I do think that they tried their what, to the extent of what was possible, to show how entrenched this had become, and also the entrenchment of the security state. But I think they sort of missed an opportunity when at the end they sort of made it about a personal feud. And I think it takes already having an ideological framework to identify that this person who they sort of made out had a personal agenda against Oppenheimer and sort of led these interrogations against him. It takes already having a framework to understand that it was not purely personal, it was ideological. And I just think that these things should be made clear if you're going to make a movie which claims to, bring forward these issues.
Can I just say one small thing? And here, I'm not a filmmaker. I don't know that much about filmmaking. But wouldn't it have been, with all of the sex scenes, and there were not a lot, but there were enough to keep you focused, on the movie, if that's what you're interested in. And it was put in there for that reason. Let's keep it real. But wouldn't it have been, just like you had Niels Bohr walk through and say something, which I couldn't hear too well. Wouldn't it have been an amazing thing to see Paul Robeson standing? And how much would that have taken?
I was thinking the same thing, or Du Bois.
Yeah.
People who are actual victims of. Okay, sorry, go on.
Yeah, but who were also victims of it because they were fighting against nuclear weapons and their proliferation and nuclear war. It wouldn't have taken much. And since so much of the film was about communists, but it seems that the circles that they moved in were all white communists. At least I don't remember any, But just to have brought, that would have at least given people a sense of a movement, that it was not just a scientist, but a vast movement of people all over the world. I think that would have added something so politically significant. And here I agree with Eddie. There's certain things they would not do. And the question is why? It's simple. If you could have Niels Bohr, you could have certainly have had, for the period of the early Cold War, Robeson, Du Bois, and whoever else, and you could have easily, and I know that that Oppenheimer, being Jewish, he knew about the Rosenbergs. And they knew this was anti-Semitism and this whole idea that the Jews were disloyal by nature, which was part of Hitler's ideology. And so okay, that's all I wanted to say.
Well, dog, just
I'm
to
ready to come in. Okay, go ahead. Fine.
I just wanted to say what Niels Bohr actually said in that comment. I think it's interesting for free school discussions because we've been talking about it. What he actually said when he meets Oppenheimer is he says, basically, I'm paraphrasing, I don't remember exact words, but he says, welcome, to the world of quantum theory. The people who don't believe in this like to pretend that there's a real world behind quantum, the world of quantum physics. That was what he said.
Wait, can you interpret that? Because I think I interpreted it differently. But can you? What were you? What do you think Niels Bohr meant by that?
No, not Bohr. I think I was saying Born or
Bond was
Bond was there. It was Bond. He goes to attend a lecture
No,
by
Niels
With the
Bohr.
Heisenberg? You're talking about in the beginning, right?
yeah,
No.
at the very beginning
Oh,
he
yeah,
attends a
yeah.
lecture.
No, wasn't it Niels Bohr?
Yeah, it's Niels Bohr.
Yeah.
you were saying in
Oh,
that
yeah.
more
Oh well, so I interpreted. So I actually like. Okay, so
Okay,
Well, could you tell us? Do you know what he said?
yeah, he said he's basically like you should go to Germany because Cambridge. They're in Cambridge, and Niels Bohr says Cambridge is not going to satisfy your intellectual pursuits because Niels Bohr is impressed by Oppenheimer at this point. He says, "Oh, you asked me the same question at Cambridge that you asked me at Harvard when you attended my lecture at Harvard." And then he says, "Were you satisfied with my answer this time?" And then Oppenheimer cheekily says, "Yes, I was more satisfied this time." And then Niels Bohr says, your intellectual pursuits in new physics will not be satisfied in Cambridge. I don't know the tradition of Cambridge physics, but I'm guessing it's like more mechanical. I don't know. So then he says, you should actually go to Germany.
No, but that's in the beginning.
Yeah,
That's
that's
the first part. No, but Niels Bohr's comes up at the end and the last part.
He's in both parts.
Yeah, he's in
In both parts, yes.
but Purba was referring to the first part.
No, you were talking about the first part. Oh, okay. Does anybody know what he said in the second time he shows up?
And the second time he said that he didn't come to be a part of the project because he doesn't want to basically build a bomb.
He doesn't want what?
He doesn't want to build a bomb.
No, but it was after World War II that he shows up the second, isn't it?
No, he does not show
This
up.
is why the timeline stuff gets confusing.
Yes.
And there's so many characters, and I wish there were name tags, but that's not realistic.
I think Niels Bohr was captured somewhere and kept somewhere in Cleveland, and then during the Manhattan Project, while they were developing the bomb, the U.S. military sort of extracts him from Cleveland and brings him to Los Alamos, where he meets Oppenheimer and says that I came back, but I don't want to be a part of this project. But I actually, over the last couple of days, I've talked to several people about this question, about exactly what you were talking about, that why didn't they have somebody like Robeson? Why didn't they have somebody during the McCarthy era, like Henry Winston, or somebody like, Davis? And I really thought about it, and I think that very superficially, I think I came up with an answer that made sense in my head, which was that this movie was from the perspective of Oppenheimer. We are looking, or we are viewing this movie through his eyes. We only get to know the people that he interacts with. And so from the very beginning, the communist circles that he interacts with are these white communists. When he goes to Los Alamos, he only interacts with the scientists. After that, I think that when he's being interviewed during the McCarthy era, even then, the surveillance on him is so rigorous that he doesn't really communicate very much uh, with people outside his very inner circle. Um, and then and so I think that the entire movie we're watching through his eyes. and we are not deviating from any of that, which is why the relevant parts of history, which we would expect to be shown in this movie as part of the of denuclearization. Like Albert Einstein and Robeson were both part of these committees against nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. So, but he's not involved in that. He's not involved in that, and hence we don't see.
But Shantanu, how do we know that?
That's
I mean, he was an intellectual. He moved among intellectuals. Robeson was the most prominent public intellectual of that time. If Einstein knew and interacted with them, Oppenheimer, the film, and we have to read the biography. I got to get that book, but we just don't know. But I would make the rejoinder that, in the interest of context, would have been important, because one of the things they tell us about Oppenheimer is he understood the scientist was a part of society, and that he had a responsibility, or she had a responsibility to society. And so, I mean, it would be so natural for him to know and probably have crossed paths, certainly with Paul Robeson.
Can I give my review? As the person who has most recently seen the film out of all of us on Thursday night, I think there is a difference between criticizing Oppenheimer's life versus criticizing the film, and like they're also related, but I feel like my big critique is that I found myself actually really enjoying the first half, and then really feeling actually unhappy by the second half. And I actually think the discussion clarified it, because I agree with what Doc said about the need, what Doc pointed out about that at the very least, what would have made the film even stronger is actually to take Oppenheimer's life all the way to like a more universal place, which is to bring it to humanity's movement. Because basically I think that Christopher Nolan was basically trying to depict the tragedy of Oppenheimer, and not just Oppenheimer as Oppenheimer, but even Oppenheimer as like a scientist who has like allowed America to like unleash, a scientist who has like allowed the world and America to unleash nuclear weapons on the world or whatever. But I actually think Christopher Nolan I don't think he did a good job at that, because I actually think the real tragedy of Oppenheimer is, I feel like the real, when I say tragedy, I don't mean like, ooh, sad tragedy. What I mean is like, how Du Bois says the whole point of art is to not fabricate a story, but actually be able to capture the real essence of human tragedy that's all around us. Like history, like that's kind of what I'm pulling from, where I actually feel like the real tragedy shouldn't have been about Oppenheimer as a scientist who produced nuclear weapons, but should have been brought to the level of the tragedy of the death of science as part of society and philosophy and art, which would, like you said, include, actually ironically, Hollywood and public intellectuals, and like you're saying, like would punish activists like Paul Robeson. Like for me, I feel like the thing, because the reason why I liked the first part was, okay, I actually like the pyrotechnics, and the reason why is because it's because I am used to a certain type of physics, which is so abstract that I feel nothing for it. I'm just like, I never would ever could have considered majoring in physics. I could not give a single flying fuck about physics. But then, actually, which is also why I was also kind of like, I've been confused about our conversations about string theory all these weeks. But then I watched the first half of the film, and the pyrotechnics where like Oppenheimer is like, oh my God, like I'm going to Germany, and he's looking at art, and then there's interlaid with the pyrotechnics of like fission and fusion and the connection between the abstract universal and the concrete universal, or that's how I was seeing it. I was like, oh shit. I actually thought to myself, I was like, maybe that's why Nandita Raju and Purba are physicists, because I was like, maybe in India this is how they still teach physics, and maybe if I were born in a different era I would have been a physicist. You know what I mean? So I was into the pyrotechnics actually, and like I was into the language of pyrotechnics and then the music, and I was like really feeling it. I was like, it was like the first 30 minutes and I was like, this is gonna be a great film. Like I was super into it. But then the part that I was so dissatisfied was by the end, where not only did Christopher Nolan not expand what I felt was a kernel of potential from the beginning, which was Nolan was pursuing this story of back then science was a part of society where physics, if you're a physicist, you're not just a scientist the way we see scientists now, but you're a philosopher. This is a human, like, like you're a philosopher, you're an artist, you're a scientist. Like if you're in Hollywood, you're an intellectual, you're going to be involved in political movements. Like everything is embedded. And what I felt once it reached the stage of basically Cold War, which Christopher Nolan doesn't completely name, but he is trying to be like, oh wait, there's anti-communism, blah, blah, blah. Once Christopher Nolan in the film reaches that place, that's where I think he fumbles the bag. And that's where I think what he should have done is he should have expanded Oppenheimer's life to the human movement, which is like not just about like not just doing more of a deeper, like giving us a deeper understanding of how much we as Americans, as humanity have lost, which is like the real science, the real art, real Hollywood, all this stuff, but also like real politics, real human movement. He could have he could have expanded it to that ultimate tragedy, which is also like degraded any true vanguard against nuclear weapons. But instead, all Christopher Nolan could do was reduce it to like, and that's why nuclear weapons are bad. And like, that's why nuclear weapons are bad. And Oppenheimer let this happen and he's like regretting it. And like, that's okay, right? But I feel like the film, that's why I think the film did a poor job of actually capturing the real human tragedy, which is the Cold War's violence against, it's not just about like, oh, we have a nuclear war policy and these silly anti-communists, and like Southern accent Truman and like senators, like these silly, absurd, like politicians don't like get how dangerous this is. I feel like that's a reductive story. And I actually feel like real history has shown, kind of like what Jeremiah was saying, that like Christopher Nolan was maybe trying to get at, but I don't know if I agree with that, which is the real human tragedy is the Cold War's deliberate compartmentalizing or like basically attack on such an integrated human movement, not just in the US, but around the world, of intellectuals and science, art, like all, like even the academy, like universities, purposely, deliberately, like under attack and successfully were attacked. And that's why you have to this day a science in America that is like meaningless, technical, like universities don't really teach young people like the stars. They don't teach young people the stars. You also have the death of like movements around the world. And like, yeah, I don't know. So that's what I thought, because I really didn't like the ending scene. I thought it was so stupid. I was like, I see what you're trying to do. Christopher Nolan was like trying to wrap the movie like a present with a bow and be like, neat. It's nice and neat. The ultimate parable is that kids, nuclear weapons are bad. And you should be a good scientist. Like you should try to do your best. Like Oppenheimer tried his best, but he didn't succeed. But like I hope you learn from his life and things are all right. And like, that's also why I think like Nolan could have actually used Einstein's life to better attach a greater, like more broad, universal human movement that Oppenheimer's life is a like small kaleidoscope of. But instead, he had to make Einstein like a bumbling fool, like, ha ha, I'm a German and I can't understand anything I'm saying, but I wear sweaters and like I wear little cute hats and I'm just a cute little German man who like does science, which no one understands, and I'm a dinosaur.
Yeah. Can I just say a few things? Because, yeah, no, I the thing is that I will still say that I like the movie, but I also appreciate the conversation because, yeah, this is the part where I guess like differing views can also produce something. I think,
Like vision and fusion.
yeah, like synthesis. But okay, the first thing about like the filmmaking stuff is like I think Shantanu and Emily talked about this, but it has to be distinguished whether you're criticizing Oppenheimer's life versus criticizing what the film is doing, which is, as people have said, the film chooses as its project to focus on the life of Oppenheimer and his subjective experience, which Shantanu says. And I think you have to be clear about, oh, that is a wrong project to do. Because I feel like that's part of where the critiques are coming in, but I feel like it's a little confusing to be about when we're critiquing the film's project as opposed to just criticizing the things that Oppenheimer did in reality, like in history. And yeah, that was one thing I wanted to say. But I guess the other thing is the way that I approach the movie is as a Hollywood movie. And that's partially why I appreciate it more, is because it did things that I felt were unusual for Hollywood films. And I didn't approach it as a revolutionary piece of art by any means, but it was like, oh, like, because in some ways also, I feel like I grew up with watching Christopher Nolan movies as like, yeah, like Jahan mentioned, The Dark Knight, Inception, I guess like his movie on Dunkirk, all of that stuff. And I'm used to a certain kind of filmmaking from Nolan. And he did indulge in some of those tendencies, but also it felt like the most un-Christopher Nolan movie that I've seen, which was interesting. And that, I mean, that just may be my interpretation of it. But yeah, like my basic response is, it did things that I'm not used to seeing in Hollywood movies. And that also, but that still comes with limitations because, yeah, I agree with everyone. It is ultimately still a Hollywood movie. And there are always going to be limitations with that. But I think that was my initial reaction to it. And yeah, I think part of what I'm arguing for is, was the movie able to put certain questions on the table still? And I think that I actually kind of disagree with whether this movie was threatening or not, because the reactions that I've seen from like looking at how scientists have reacted to the movie, like writing in like scientific journals and stuff like that, is they will try to very quickly say like, oh, like the threat of nuclear weapons is still with us, as seen in like Putin's thing, like that Putin is the main threat of nuclear war. But I feel like that's actually a sign of their discomfort. It's a sign of the scientists being discomforted by the fact that the movie does. I feel like the movie made very clear that all of the shit that basically the Cold War happened because the United States willed it to happen. The U.S. government willed it to happen. The nuclear arms race happened because of the U.S. government, and that it wouldn't have happened if the U.S. government had not made those choices, and that the Soviet Union was not really interested in developing nuclear weapons except because of the U.S. government. And I feel like that was actually a point that was made pretty clearly, at least from my interpretation. And I think that is part of this is maybe me reading into things a little bit, but I feel like the reaction of like people like scientists, for instance, to be like, oh yeah, this is just like what's happening with Russia and Putin threatening the world with nuclear weapons. I feel like that is them exhibiting a sign of almost like unease with the things that the film brings to the table. Although, yeah, that's more of, I think, of like a personal subjective interpretation maybe. But I do think that as a Hollywood film, first of all, yeah, I felt like it did things that I wasn't used to seeing, but that it is still within that kind of sphere, I guess, and it has to be interpreted as such. But also that I do think that it triggers certain anxieties amongst people who are part of the establishment, whether they're scientists or critics or whatever. Because everywhere you'll see, even one of the co-authors of American Prometheus, the original biography, he wrote this article in the New York Times basically saying the same thing, which is that, yeah, like this is exactly like what Putin is doing. He's threatening the world with nuclear weapons. And also that like he made this connection between Oppenheimer and Fauci and how they're like similar figures in like American public life or something. But the thing is that, yeah, like, I just feel like there are certain times and moments when, like, a piece of art can go beyond what the filmmaker actually intends for it in terms of its impact. And I don't know, I could be wrong about that, but also, yeah, I think the last thing I want to say is, like, to go back to the first point, I think that, yeah, like, it's always a tricky question to ask, why didn't a film show this thing? Because there's infinite number of things that a film could not show, that a film could show. And so I think that you have to make a strong argument for this was a glaringly obvious thing that the film did not choose to show, as opposed to, like, oh, like, I just wish they had shown this thing, which I think is much more also because, like, we as free school have obviously were invested in a particular way of understanding Cold War history, which obviously Christopher Nolan has never been exposed to. And, like, I don't even know if he knows who Paul Robeson is. Like, maybe he does. But yeah, I think, like, also because the thing is that part of the limitation of the film is that I think Nolan relied very heavily on the text material, like the written biography of American Prometheus. And I would be pretty confident that they would not talk about Paul Robeson in that book. And so I think it's, like, understanding, like, the limitations, but also I just feel like my response to it is that I felt like it was able to put certain questions on the table that, one, I was not really expecting, but also I think are questions that actually have to be addressed. And it's to the extent that might be me reading into it, but to the extent that we as free schools feel dissatisfied with it, or a general audience might feel dissatisfied with it, part of that is, I think, because the questions that were raised during the Cold War period have not been fully answered by the American people yet. Mm-hmm. And there's always going to be a kind of dissatisfaction with that. And the question is should art, especially in terms of dealing with, like, mainstream art, Hollywood art, should we expect the art to answer the question, or should we at least be, I don't know, I feel like I just appreciate the fact that the art can put the question on the table in the first place, because it still remains like this story ultimately is something that needs to be written by the American people. They are the American people need to decide how they actually stand on this question. And that has not really been decided yet in the course of our history. And I don't know, that maybe that's me reading into it a bit, but, like, to the extent that maybe we feel dissatisfied, it could be because, like, this question as a whole has not been answered yet. And I would not have expected, and I don't think that it is fair to expect this kind of Hollywood film to answer those questions when they haven't been even answered in the course of, like, the arena of political struggle yet, and especially in, like, the contemporary context. But anyway, I could maybe feel a little defensive because, yeah, I still like the movie, but yeah. Anyways.
Well, okay. Well, because one thing I would say though is, I feel like Christopher Nolan, I feel like the film it tried to pose the question of, like, science for war, but I actually feel like the film posed, I feel like the reason why I hated the ending scene so much was I feel like it relegated itself to the wrong question being posed, which is, I feel like what they tried to do with the whole Einstein gifting, like, it was almost like Einstein was passing on the burden of science to Oppenheimer. That was the whole point. And I feel like what it does is that it makes it too simplistic, where it's like, oh, I'm passing on the burden of being Prometheus, like the power of Prometheus and science to Oppenheimer, when actually that's not the point. The point is about the impact of the Cold War on knowledge production. Like, that is the question. The question is, like, is the question of the what is it called? The deep state, ruling elite, consensus, whatever, on, like, that's effect to this day on ideological clarity and knowledge production. Yeah. It's not just a question of should Oppenheimer have made the weapon, like, should Oppenheimer have done this or that or whatever, because actually after that scene in the film, chronologically speaking, like, Oppenheimer spent a lot of his life, like, opposing the H-bomb, which they tried to show, but, like, that's also that's not an Oppenheimer fight. Protesting the H-bomb is a political struggle of the American people, like a whole movement that includes, Robeson and other people, but also it's a world movement with the Soviet Union, the anti-colonial struggle, like the whole Bandung's #1, or is it not a line movement? their number one demand was no nuclear weapons, like
Mhm.
nothing else, just simply we don't want a nuclear arms race.
Mhm.
But
I just want to say something very quickly. Is that I think I to a large extent I agree with Jeremiah when he says that this is a Hollywood movie, and and I had actually quite low expectations while going to watch the movie, and I can say that it was it exceeded my expectations. That's what I can say, because it was the film did not portray was not portrayed as anti-communist. It wasn't anti-Stalin. It wasn't anti-Soviet Union. It wasn't anti-JFK. And you can say that being anti something is not enough. You have to be for something. But just looking at the movies that Hollywood usually makes, you can say that okay, this is at least exceeded my expectations in that way. You can put up the argument that this is something extremely relevant that should have been in the movie, but in the same vein, I was thinking about it would have been so easy to put something derogatory about the Soviet Union or Stalin or JFK, and they didn't do all of these things. They didn't put a dialogue or two in there saying that how Stalin was a brutal dictator or the Soviet Union was always looking to for violent options, which is everywhere, and they didn't do it, and so that way it exceeded my expectations. So yeah, I mean, it's still a Hollywood movie.
Can I just say something? Like, I just wanted to add that this point that Jeremiah brought up before, and I think Purva also mentioned this about like ambivalence, how Oppenheimer as an ambivalent figure. I think I agree with that. I liked how the movie sort of shows that not taking a stand, I think at some points can actually do more harm than you can anticipate, because I think when he later on talks about disarmament, at one point the person says, "But you helped build the bomb. How can you talk about disarmament now? Isn't it paradoxical?" Like I think that was very important. I thought that was quite important because I mean, this thing about like the thing we talk about, like about the fierce urgency of now, like I think it is true that educators or like people in science are constantly told this, that you have to remain neutral because that's what rational beings do, to take in both the sides and not take your opinion shouldn't come in way of things, but the importance of taking a stand has like a larger, like it can yeah, like you are responsible to the larger society, and hence you must take a stand even if that later on goes on to be wrong or whatever, but it's more important to take a stand than remaining neutral. I think that was pretty important, which I thought, yeah, the movie did but yeah, everything else was great from in the discussion, I mean. Yeah.
Well, I think in response to what Jeremiah said, I mean, I think that in my whatever movies I've seen, like the uh obviously after McCarthyism, the best that Hollywood has been able to reach is skepticism of the system and skepticism of power, and perhaps putting the that question in the sense of like, what is, like, should we trust the government or should we trust the powers that be forward, and but has never really been able to go beyond that to the bigger question of what is the alternative, and to actually engage in deep pedagogy. But in that sense, I am sympathetic to what Jeremiah said, that the movie was, I felt, successful in bringing that skepticism about the system and the powers that be, and that was obviously more than a low bar of what I expect. So in that sense, I appreciated it. But at the same time, I also wanted to say one thing which we haven't discussed. While it was good in that sense, the risk of nuclear war and so on, one area where it repeated propaganda was the actual decision to drop the atom bomb on Japan. And so, I mean, in that, even putting aside the thing of they didn't show the victims of the bombings, they didn't show like how all the top military commanders in the U.S. and Britain, including I believe Eisenhower, who later became president, they all said there was no military value, there was no need to drop those bombs, and the bombs were entirely just aimed at the USSR and to prevent Japan from surrendering to the USSR. In which case, we would be living in a different world because Japan could have potentially been like a North Korea if that had happened. And so, anyway, just regurgitated that propaganda, which was a huge problem in the movie. And unfortunately, we are still being taught that the bombings were necessary. But yeah, I'm just left with the question of why does it, the questions Jeremiah was saying, why now are they even is this movie putting that question forward? Like, why now and not 10 years ago? I think the biography came out in 2006, so there's been some time that it's been out, but why is it out now, you know? It's just what I'm trying to figure out.
Because people are scared of nuclear war.
Yeah, I mean that is a good question because you know Hollywood is one of the principal mechanisms of the ideological struggle, and if you don't mind me saying, you know, with Christopher Nolan, a lot of virtue signaling, a lot of his generation filmmakers are not like the ones during the Cold War. It's a different Hollywood. Our hands are clean. And I think, and here, you know, this, you know, you can take this for what it's worth. You know, my sense of the ruling class is what they do, they try to wrap in a moral imperative. We're not what we were. So if we drop the bomb today, it's not the same as in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They did it for unclear and bad reasons. If we drop a bomb in Ukraine or North Korea, we're doing it because it is a political necessity. Because again, you know, see, there's so many, you know, I'd say to Jeremiah, you know, there's so many subtexts to this. So many subtexts. And I don't know Christopher Nolan's work, but I suspect him. I'm suspicious. Forgive me for saying it like this. Because there is, you know, the more we talk about, then other questions come up. You know, like Jahan said, why now? And like Jerry said, you read what scientists say, the more sophisticated people, that is, in terms of their educations, they go right to Russia, not to the United States, which is threatening it. So there is that subtext, that comforting of the American public mind to feel as though, well, if we have them now, it's because they're necessary to defeat evil people. And of course, we all know that Putin is today's world's Adolf Hitler, you know? So, okay, we're able and we do, and it's right, to give Nolan the benefit of the doubt. And I agree with Jerry about this. You know, sometimes we can do more with a piece of cinema than the director himself could do. And now let's be clear. I mean, even though Nolan is the representative, he didn't make that movie alone. That was a movie made by committee. And the politics are as important, if not more important, than the quote art itself. So who are the other people involved? I failed to stay long enough to see the credits, but sometimes they go by so fast you can't say, well, who, you know. But there are more people in this than just Christopher Nolan. He's the face of something deeper. The other thing is, given the critical moment, I don't think that this movie could have been made or was made without some consulting of the State Department, the Deep State, the CIA, and everything else. It's a highly political movie, and I think, okay, we can call it art, but it's political art in the interest of certain political interests. That's
Compared it to AI.
Okay, well, I think those were a powerful series of questions to end free school with. What do you think, Doc? But I mean, there are a few comments. Should we read them?
Oh yeah. Just a few comments responding to the movie. Nuri said that I also wish Oliver Stone had made the movie, and that I agree, I think, with earlier parts of the discussion that the world situation is starting to impact filmmakers' consciousness and drive, but that doesn't mean that popular Hollywood people like Nolan are fully up to the task of telling the story. And then Danny just added that Niels Bohr shows up later in the movie in New Mexico when they're building the bomb because they were able to get him out of Copenhagen during World War II. And then BK says that Hollywood is still stuck in the web of Operation Mockingbird, which was, I think, like a coordinated effort to with like the CIA and then like in Hollywood and the press to kind of push like deep state narratives in a covert manner. And then Where Pilgrim just liked Emily's comment about how the moral of the story just seems to be like, oh, be a good little scientist.
The reason why I said the good scientist thing is because I feel like that's the whole point of the heavy-handed inclusion of Lewis Strauss. So that's what I thought. Like, why did you have to make the end of the movie about Oppenheimer versus Strauss? You know, like, weird. I thought it was kind of weird, or like, I felt like it was a distraction. But
and then Marianne Edwards says it's interesting how differently Stephen Hawking's movie and the Oppenheimer movie have been portrayed in terms of tone and focus on certain life events. Yeah, I forgot about the Stephen Hawking movie. But yeah. Okay, those are all the comments on the film.
Hey Jerry, could you say something? I don't know the Stephen Hawking's movie.
Oh, there was it came out a few years ago, but there's a movie about Stephen Hawking.
It's called The Theory of Everything.
But it's more like a love movie. It's like a love story, kind of. It's not really political at all.
And this is like right after he died too, and they turned it into a romantic drama.
Yeah.
That's so odd. Well, the only other comment that I would like to supply from Serafina is free school can make its own movie on Oppenheimer. We can and include No,
if I made a movie about a physicist, it would be Einstein.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there a movie about Einstein?
They probably are, but they're all bad, most likely.
I can see. Yeah. I don't think the world of physics has recovered from the death of Einstein, because he was the quote ultimate authority figure. Because the real revolution in physics occurs with relativity, and that quantum mechanics is on the heels of that, and it doesn't complete where Einstein's theory of relativity completed the revolution from Newtonian to new physics. Um, and without Einstein or an Einstein figure, we're lost in this BS that's called theoretical physics, which is string theory.
I was joking to Jeremiah. I was like, the science reading group can make a movie about string theory. Okay, we got some takers. Okay, well, I think we can end here. Next week, I know we didn't get to the review of Martin Wolf's book, Raju's review of Martin Wolf's book, which I'm really excited about. I haven't finished reading it. And then also Michelle's review of Lorraine Hansberry's play. But as usual, a very exhilarating free school. Thank you for everyone who participated in the comments, and we'll see you next week. And hopefully we didn't spoil too much of the movie for you.